Hey guys, tonight the first topic we explore reveals a haunting truth about the past, the way women's emotions, fears, and mental health were once misunderstood, misdiagnosed, and even punished.
From ancient medicine to Victorian asylums, from so-called hysteria to dangerous remedies, we're about to walk through centuries of treatments, both bizarre and heartbreaking, that were once considered normal.
So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you.
It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin our journey in ancient Greece, land of philosophers, myths, and oddly specific medical theories.
Imagine for a moment the atmosphere of that time. The air is warm and smells of dry earth and olive trees. In the great stone temples and the quiet study rooms of the early physicians, men were trying to make sense of the human body. They looked at nature, at the stars, and at the physical form, trying to draw lines of logic between them.
But when it came to women, their logic often took a turn into the fantastical.
It was here, over 2,000 years ago, that the seed of our story was planted. This is where the concept of hysteria was born. Though they did not use the word in the way we use it today, the word itself comes from the Greek word hystera, which simply translates to uterus. From the very beginning, the medical understanding of a woman's anxiety, her sadness, or her physical pain was inextricably tied to her anatomy. It was not a matter of the mind, or the soul, or the chemical balance of the brain as we understand it now. It was entirely a matter of the womb. The physicians of ancient Greece, including the famous Hippocrates, who is often called the father of medicine, held a belief that sounds almost mythological to our modern ears.
They believed that the uterus was not a stationary organ.
They believed it was a living thing within a living thing. They described it as an animal within an animal.
According to their texts, this organ had a mind of its own.
It had desires and preferences, and most famously, it had the ability to move. This is the theory of the wandering womb.
Picture the medical diagrams of the time, drawn on parchment with ink.
The physicians believed that if a uterus was not satisfied, usually meaning if a woman was not pregnant or frequently intimate, the organ would become restless.
It would detach from its proper place in the lower body and begin to float.
It would wander through the torso, searching for moisture or searching for warmth. If the womb moved upward toward the diaphragm, they believed it would crowd the lungs. This, they said, was the cause of shortness of breath or a feeling of suffocation. If it moved toward the heart, it would cause palpitations and anxiety. If it moved toward the head, it would cause headaches, dizziness, or drowsiness.
Every symptom a woman could possibly experience, from a simple stomachache to a severe panic attack, was attributed to this single wandering organ. It is a strange image to visualize, the idea that a part of your body could simply go for a walk inside you because it was unhappy. But this was the prevailing science.
It was the absolute truth for the scholars of the day. And because they believed the cause was physical movement, the treatments they designed were intended to physically coax the organ back into place. This is where the history becomes sensory, involving the sense of smell in a very potent way. The Greeks believed that the wandering womb had a sense of smell.
They thought it was attracted to pleasant scents and repelled by foul ones. So if a woman came to a physician complaining of anxiety or feeling of pressure in her chest, the diagnosis was immediate. Her womb had wandered upwards.
To fix this, the physician would employ a two-part strategy of scent.
They would place foul-smelling substances near the woman's nose.
They might burn charred wool, or use bitumen or sulfur. The idea was that the offensive odor would disgust the womb, forcing it to retreat downwards, away from the head and chest. At the same time, they would apply sweet-smelling substances to the lower body. They would use perfumes, fragrant oils, or steam baths infused with herbs. The pleasant aroma was meant to act as a lure, calling the wandering organ back to its rightful home.
Imagine the scene in a quiet, stone-walled room in Athens.
The light is dim, perhaps coming from a single oil lamp. The air is thick with smoke. A woman sits, perhaps feeling anxious or simply exhausted, while a physician wafts the smoke of burnt wool toward her face.
It is a slow, methodical process. There is no urgency, just a calm application of a theory that seems wild to us, but was treated with the utmost seriousness then. They also believed in the power of gravity to correct this internal alignment. There were texts that suggested physically shaking the patient, or having them sneeze, to jolt the organ back into place.
But the scent therapy was the most common, a gentle yet bizarre form of manipulation as we move forward in time. Leaving the sun-drenched pillars of Greece, we see that this idea did not die out. It was stubborn. It traveled across the Mediterranean. It was translated into Latin.
It found its way into the medical texts of Rome.
The Romans, for all their engineering and architectural genius, adopted much of Greek medicine.
Galen, a prominent Roman physician, argued slightly against the idea of the uterus moving like a wild animal, but he still believed that the retention of fluids within the womb was the cause of female illness.
The connection remained.
The woman's mental state was not her own.
It was a byproduct of her biology.
Let us drift now through the centuries.
The Roman Empire falls. Europe enters the Middle Ages. The libraries are closed. The scrolls are lost or hidden away in monasteries.
The understanding of the human body shifts from the philosophical to the theological in the medieval period. The view of hysteria took a darker turn.
The wandering womb theory persisted in some medical circles, but it began to mix with religious superstition.
If a woman was behaving strangely, if she was too loud, too independent, or prone to fits of emotion, it was not just a medical issue. It was a spiritual one.
The damp, cold stone of medieval castles and the mud of the villages set the scene for this era. Life was harder.
Medicine was a mix of prayer and herbal remedies.
The definition of a troubled woman began to expand.
It wasn't just physical pain anymore.
It was her voice. It was her behavior. During these centuries, the symptoms of what we might now call depression, epilepsy, or severe anxiety were often viewed through the lens of morality. Was the woman possessed? Was she under a spell?
Or was she simply suffering from the frailty of her gender?
The treatments became harsher. While the Greeks used smells to coax the body, the medievalists used prayers, holy water, and sometimes exorcisms. But beneath the spiritual layer, the old medical ideas survived.
Physicians still prescribed marriage as a cure. They still believed that a woman's purpose was to bear children, and any deviation from that path would result in illness.
The body would rebel if it was not fulfilling its function. As we move slowly out of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the light of science begins to flicker again. We see the rise of anatomy theatres.
We see artists like Da Vinci drawing the human form with incredible precision. You might think that once they opened the body and looked inside, they would see that the uterus is held firmly in place by ligaments. You might think they would see it cannot wander.
And yet, old ideas are heavy.
They are hard to move.
Even as anatomists proved that the womb was stationary, the concept of hysteria as a catch-all diagnosis remained. It was too convenient to let go of. It was the perfect explanation for anything that men found confusing about women. By the time we reach the 16th and 17th centuries, the world is changing.
Cities are growing.
The printing press is spreading knowledge. But for women suffering from mental anguish, the medical world was still a place of confusion. We start to see a shift in the description of hysteria. It moves from being purely about the womb wandering to being about vapors. This is a word you hear often in vintage literature.
A woman having a fit of the vapors. The theory was that the uterus, if unhappy, produced toxic fumes.
These vapors would rise up through the body, like steam rising in a chimney.
They would cloud the brain, causing confusion, fainting, and emotional outbursts.
This era brings us the image of the fainting couch, the delicate woman, laced tightly into a corset, swooning at the slightest shock.
While corsets and restricted breathing certainly played a role in fainting, the medical diagnosis was still rooted in that ancient Greek idea.
The womb was still the culprit, even if it wasn't walking around anymore.
It was now a factory of toxic air.
The treatments for these vapors were diverse and often focused on calming the system down.
We see the introduction of herbal teas, of long periods of rest, but we also see the beginning of the rest cure, which would become infamous in the Victorian era. Let us pause here for a moment and just breathe.
Imagine the quiet scratching of a quill on paper.
A doctor in a velvet coat is writing a prescription for a woman who is simply tired of her domestic confinement. He writes that she needs to stay in bed.
She needs to avoid reading. She needs to avoid thinking.
He believes he is saving her from the vapors. He believes he is kind.
This is the tragedy that runs through the history of hysteria.
Many of these physicians were not evil men.
They were simply operating on a map of the human body that was drawn incorrectly. They were trying to navigate a territory they did not understand, using a compass that always pointed to the same wrong north. As we drift closer to the 18th century, the age of enlightenment, electricity begins to capture the imagination of the public and the scientists. It was a mysterious, invisible force. It could spark, it could shock, and naturally, doctors began to wonder if it could cure. We see the first experiments with electrotherapy, not the high-voltage shocks of modern psychiatry, but static electricity.
Devices were built to generate a charge.
Women suffering from nervous disorders were brought in to be electrified. The belief was that the nervous system was dull or sluggish, and a spark would wake it up.
Imagine a heavy wooden machine with a spinning glass wheel. As it turns, it creates a crackling sound. A woman places her hand on a conductor.
She feels a snap, a jolt. It is startling.
Does it cure her anxiety? Probably not.
But it is the newest science, so it must be right. This fascination with machinery and external forces sets the stage for the Industrial Revolution of medicine.
And it brings us to the doorstep of the Victorian era, the golden age of hysteria.
This is where the story becomes most crowded with bizarre inventions, strict social rules, and the rise of the asylum. The Victorian era, spanning the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, is often remembered for its fork-filled streets, its top hats, and its rigid morality. But in the quiet, curtained rooms of middle and upper-class homes, there was a silent epidemic. Hysteria became the most common diagnosis for women.
It was a label applied to almost everything. If a woman was irritable, she was hysterical. If she lost her appetite, hysterical.
If she had a high sex drive, hysterical.
If she had no sex drive, hysterical.
The list of symptoms attributed to this condition grew to fill pages and pages of medical textbooks.
A famous physician of the time catalogued over 75 distinct pages of symptoms. It covered fluid retention, muscle spasms, headaches, insomnia, heaviness in the limbs, and a tendency to cause trouble. Essentially, being a human being with complex emotions was, for a woman, a medical condition.
The doctor's office in the Victorian era was a place of heavy furniture and hushed tones.
When a woman arrived, she was often accompanied by her husband or father. The men would speak.
The woman would be observed. The prevailing medical theory had evolved from the vapors to a problem of nervous irritation. The nerves were seen as wires that had become frayed or overstimulated, and the source of this irritation was, once again, the reproductive system. It was in this environment that doctors began to perform manual treatments.
This is the part of history that is often whispered about, the clinical massage. Physicians believed that by manually stimulating the pelvic region, they could release the pent-up nervous energy.
They called the result a hysterical paroxysm. We would recognize it today as a release of tension, a physical climax. But in the Victorian mind, this was not sexual. It was purely medical.
It was a procedure, like draining a boil or setting a bone.
It was tedious work for the doctors.
They complained in their journals about aching hands and wrists.
They found it boring and time-consuming, and because it was a problem of efficiency, it became a problem for inventors. If the hand was too slow, surely a machine could do it better. This is the dawn of the vibrator, but not as a secret device sold in the back of a magazine.
It was a massive, steam-powered medical instrument.
Picture a large, clunky piece of machinery in a doctor's office. It has hoses and belts. It hums with a deep, mechanical rhythm. It was the manipulator. One of the first was the Chattanooga vibrator. It looked less like a personal device and more like a piece of farming equipment. Women would go to the doctor for their scheduled sessions.
They would be treated with these machines to induce the paroxysm, to balance their humors, and calm their hysteria. It was clinical.
It was detached.
And it was incredibly common.
These appointments were just part of the routine for a wealthy Victorian woman.
She might go to the dressmaker, then to the tea shop, and then to the doctor for her hysteria treatment.
It was seen as maintenance for a fragile constitution, but while some women were receiving massages, others were facing much darker treatments. For those whose symptoms were considered too severe for outpatient care, there was the asylum. The Victorian asylum is a staple of Gothic horror for a reason.
These were vast, imposing buildings, often built on the outskirts of cities.
They were warehouses for the unwanted. A woman could be committed to an asylum for hysteria by the word of her husband or father. If she was too rebellious, if she wanted to manage her own money, if she argued too much, she could be labeled insane once inside. The treatments for hysteria were no longer gentle massages.
They were punitive.
There was hydrotherapy, which sounds relaxing, but was often torture. Women were strapped into baths of ice-cold water for hours to cool their inflamed nerves.
Or they were subjected to the douche, which was a high-pressure hose of water sprayed directly at the body to shock the system. There were spinning chairs. The patient was strapped into a chair that was suspended from the ceiling and spun until she vomited. The theory was that the centrifugal force would rearrange the contents of the brain and settle the mind.
There was the rest cure, championed by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell. This was a treatment of total isolation and immobility.
The patient was confined to bed for weeks or months.
She was not allowed to read, write, sew, or even feed herself. She was force-fed a high-fat diet, often consisting of milk and cream, to build up blood. The idea was to turn the woman into a child again, to remove all intellectual stimulation and reduce her to a purely physical existence.
It was a way of breaking the will.
The famous writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman underwent this treatment. It nearly drove her mad.
She wrote The Yellow Wallpaper as a reaction to it, a chilling story about a woman locked in a room who begins to see a woman trapped behind the pattern of the wallpaper.
It was a desperate cry against the silencing of women's minds in the name of curing their bodies. These asylums were quiet places, but it was a heavy, suffocating quiet. The silence of people who have learned that speaking only brings trouble.
As we move into the late 19th century, a new figure enters the stage, a man in Vienna with a cigar and a couch.
Sigmund Freud. Freud changed the conversation about hysteria again.
He moved it away from the uterus and into the mind, but he didn't necessarily liberate women.
He just created a new cage. He argued that hysteria was psychological, caused by repressed trauma or memories. This was a step forward in acknowledging that the mind was complex.
But his theories were heavily sexualized.
He believed that almost all hysteria was rooted in repressed sexual desire or childhood experiences. While he stopped at Wandering Womb, he started the era of "it's all in your head." Women were analyzed, dissected verbally, and often told that their anxiety was their own fault,
a failure to accept their natural role.
The diagnosis of hysteria continued well into the 20th century. It wasn't until 1980 that hysterical neurosis was finally removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Think about that. For over 2,000 years, from the olive groves of Greece to the modern clinics of America, this shadow diagnosis followed women. It shifted shape. It changed from an animal to a vapor to a nerve problem to a mental complex. But the core idea remained the same, that being a woman was inherently a condition that needed to be cured. Tonight, we have only just scratched the surface of this deep and complex history. We have walked through the temples and the cold stone castles.
We have heard the hum of the Victorian machines.
In our next segment, we will dive deeper into the specific stories of the women who lived through this.
We will look at the diaries they left behind.
We will explore the fasting saints of the medieval era, women who starved themselves to gain spiritual power when they had no political power. We will look at the witch trials and how mass hysteria, a different kind of hysteria, led to the persecution of thousands.
We will also look at the brave women who fought back.
The first female doctors who had to fight just to enter the medical schools. The journalists who went undercover in asylums to expose the brutal conditions. The story of hysteria is not just a story of bad medicine.
It is a story of control, but it is also a story of resilience. Because despite the wandering wombs, the toxic vapors, the cold baths, and the silence, women survived. They kept writing, kept speaking, and eventually, they took the pen from the doctors and started writing their own history.
So, as we pause here, let the weight of this history settle.
It is in the past, a distant echo.
You are safe here, in the present, where we can look back with understanding and compassion. Let your breathing deepen. Let the tension in your shoulders drop. Unlike the wandering womb, your tension can simply fade away.
There is no machine needed here.
Just the quiet of the night and the steady rhythm of your own rest. We will continue this journey soon. For now, drift in the safety of the knowledge that you are whole, you are understood, and you are free to simply be. Good night.
We left the ancient world and the early theories of the wandering womb.
But as the centuries turned, the story of women's anxiety took on a new, more mystical shape.
We move now into the deep Middle Ages, a time of stone cloisters, flickering tallow candles, and a silence so profound it could almost be heard.
In this era, before the rise of modern psychiatry, a woman's internal struggle was often viewed through a spiritual lens.
If a woman felt an overwhelming sense of emotion, or a desire for control that she could not express in the real world, it had to go somewhere, and for many, it turned inward. Let us speak of the fasting saints in medical history. This phenomenon is sometimes called anorexia mirabilis, or miraculous lack of appetite.
Imagine a young woman in the 1300s.
Her name might be Catherine.
She lives in a world where her path is chosen for her before she is born.
She will either marry a man chosen by her father, or she will enter a convent. Her voice in the public square is quiet. Her political power is non-existent. But she has one thing she can control: her own body.
We see a wave of women during this time who stopped eating.
But they did not do it for vanity.
They did it for holiness. By refusing food, they believed they were purifying themselves, becoming lighter, closer to the divine. But historians and psychologists looking back now see something else.
They see a form of control.
A way to scream without making a sound. Catherine of Siena is a famous example. She wielded immense influence, advising popes and kings. Yet she survived on almost nothing but herbs and water.
To the people around her, she was a vessel of God. To the later Victorian doctors who studied her history, she was a classic case of hysteria, a woman using her physical body to manifest her psychological need for agency.
Picture the sensory details of her life.
The rough wall of her habit against her skin, the cold stone floor where she knelt for hours,
the scent of incense and damp masonry.
In a world that told her she was weak, her ability to deny her body's basic needs made her strong. It was a bizarre cure for the anxiety of being powerless, to become so small that you became a giant in the eyes of the church.
But not all strange behaviors were greeted with awe. As we drift from the 14th into the 15th and 16th centuries, the atmosphere darkens. The air grows colder. The wind howls around the edges of the village.
We enter the era of the witch trials and mass hysteria. This is a heavy topic, but we will observe it from a safe distance, like watching a storm from behind a thick glass window.
Hysteria is not just an individual diagnosis.
It can be collective.
In the enclosed, high-pressure environments of convents or small villages, anxiety was contagious.
We have records of motor hysteria sweeping through nunneries. It might start with one nun. Perhaps she is overworked, stressed, or suffering from what we would now call panic attacks. She begins to tremble. She might meow like a cat, or bark, or convulse.
In a modern setting, we would isolate the cause.
But in a room filled with people who believe in possession, the fear spreads like a virus. Suddenly, another nun begins to tremble.
Then another. Soon, the entire convent is in the grip of a collective fit. In France, there was a famous incident where the nuns began to meow together every day at a certain time, leaving the surrounding villages terrified. The doctors and priests at the time didn't see this as a release of extreme psychological tension.
They saw it as the work of the devil, and this misunderstanding led to tragic cause. The cure for this type of mass hysteria was often an exorcism, or worse, the accusation of witchcraft.
It is heartbreaking to realize that many of the women accused of being witches were likely just women suffering from mental illness, epilepsy, or the crushing weight of societal pressure. Their bizarre behavior, muttering to themselves, strange movements, sudden outbursts was the language of a mind in distress, misread by a fearful world. But let us leave the dark, smoky air of the trials and move forward into the light of the Enlightenment. The 1700s. There clears. The scent of old wood smoke is replaced by the smell of polished mahogany and scientific curiosity.
Medicine is trying to separate itself from religion.
Doctors want to be scientists, and in this quest, they stumble upon one of the most fascinating and theatrical cures for hysteria in history: mesmerism. You may have heard the word mesmerizing. It comes from a real man, Franz Anton Mesmer. He was a German doctor who became the toast of Paris in the late 18th century. He had a theory that was pure poetry, even if it wasn't good science.
Mesmer believed that the universe was filled with an invisible fluid.
He called it animal magnetism. He believed that this fluid flowed through all living things, like a tide.
In a healthy person, the magnetic fluid flowed smoothly.
In a sick person, and especially in a hysterical woman, the fluid was blocked. It was stuck.
His cure was to unblock the flow.
And the way he did it was nothing short of a performance.
Imagine a lavishly decorated salon in Paris.
The curtains are heavy velvet, blocking out the harsh daylight.
The room is lit by soft, golden mirrors that reflect the candlelight.
The air is perfumed with orange blossom. In the center of the room stands the bouquet. The bouquet was a large wooden tub, filled with water, iron filings, and glass. Sticking out of the tub were iron rods. Women suffering from nerves, vapors, or hysteria would come to these sessions.
They would sit around the tub, holding hands to create a circuit. They would press the iron rods against the parts of their bodies that caused them trouble: their chests, their stomachs, their heads. Then Mesmer would enter. He wore a lilac-colored silk robe. He carried a white wand.
Music would play often the ethereal, glassy sounds of the glass harmonica, an instrument that sounds like a wet finger rubbing the rim of a wine glass.
A pure humming tone that seems to vibrate inside your own head.
Mesmer would move among the women.
He would look them deep in the eyes.
He would pass his hands over their bodies without touching them, smoothing the invisible magnetic fluid. The atmosphere was intense. The power of suggestion was incredibly strong. Women would swoon.
They would cry out. They would fall into crises, which Mesmer claimed was the moment the blockage was cleared.
After the crisis, they would wake up feeling refreshed, cured of their anxiety.
Was it the magnetic fluid? No, modern science tells us it was the placebo effect on a grand scale.
It was a form of hypnosis. These women, who were often ignored or dismissed in their daily lives, were suddenly the center of attention.
They were in a beautiful room, listening to beautiful music, being told that their pain was real and that it could be washed away.
Mesmerism was eventually debunked by a royal commission which actually included Benjamin Franklin, but it laid the groundwork for something important, the realization that the mind can heal the body. It showed that hysteria was responsive to suggestion. As the 18th century bleeds into the 19th, the theatricality of mesmerism fades, and we enter the era of the nerves. The Industrial Revolution is beginning. The world is getting louder, faster, and dirtier.
Steam trains are cutting through the countryside.
Clocks are dictating daily life.
And doctors begin to theorize that this new, fast-paced world is damaging to the delicate system of women. They stopped talking as much about the wandering womb and started talking about neurasthenia, exhausted nerves.
The nerves were imagined as electrical wires. If you used them too much, the insulation would wear off. You would become high-strung. This metaphor is still with us today.
We still talk about having a breakdown or burning out. For women, the advice began to shift toward conservation of energy. If you were hysterical, it was because you had spent too much energy on things you shouldn't have, like education, or reading, or worrying about politics. This brings us to the doorstep of the Victorian home, a fortress of domesticity.
And inside this home, we find the invalid.
Being a delicate woman became almost a fashion statement in the early Victorian era.
It was a sign of status. If you were a working-class woman, you couldn't afford to be hysterical. You had to work in the factories or the fields. You had to scrub floors. But if you were a wealthy woman, you had the luxury of illness. This social dynamic complicated the medical diagnosis.
Doctors were often paid by the visit. A wealthy female patient with a chronic, fake condition like hysteria was a steady source of income.
There was almost no incentive to cure her completely. The goal was to manage her.
So, the sofa became the center of the woman's world. Let's zoom in on a specific sensory experience of a Victorian treatment. The water cure. Hydrotherapy became a massive craze.
Large, spa-like sanatoriums were built in the countryside. They were beautiful buildings with manicured gardens, but the treatments inside were often shocking. A woman diagnosed with hysteria might be prescribed the wet sheet pack. Picture this. It is early morning. The sun is just rising over the misty hills.
You are woken up by an attendant.
You are stripped and then tightly wrapped, like a mummy, in a linen sheet that has been soaked in ice-cold water. Over this wet sheet, they wrap layers of dry, heavy wool blankets to trap your body heat.
You are unable to move your arms or legs. You are left there, sometimes for hours. At first, the cold is shocking.
It takes your breath away.
But then, as your body fights to warm the water, a steam begins to generate.
You start to sweat. You drift into a strange, half-conscious state. The doctors believed this sweating was drawing the toxins of hysteria out of your pores. When you were finally unwrapped, you were rubbed down briskly, dressed, and sent to walk in the garden.
For many women, despite the initial shock, this was actually pleasant.
Why? Because for those few hours in the pack, no one demanded anything of them. They didn't have to run a household.
They didn't have to manage servants or please a husband.
They were allowed to simply exist, wrapped in a cocoon. The cure worked not because of the water, but because of the rest. However, not all water cures were gentle.
The douche was a jet of water used to blast the spine.
Doctors believed hysteria lodged in the spinal column.
By spraying high-pressure water up and down the back, they thought they could shock the nerves back into alignment.
It was painful and frightening, a sharp contrast to the slow, heavy atmosphere of the sanatorium.
As we look at these treatments, the starving, the mesmerizing, the wrapping in wet sheets, we see a pattern. They are all attempts to impose order on a chaotic interior world.
The men of medicine looked at the complex, shifting emotional landscape of women, and felt a need to contain it,
to wrap it, to cool it down,
to silence it, but the women were always there, behind the diagnosis. In the diaries of Victorian women, we find the truth.
They write about boredom,
Crushing, endless boredom.
They write about the frustration of having intelligent minds, but being told their only purpose is to arrange flowers and bear children.
Imagine sitting in a parlor. The clock on the mantel ticks. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn to keep the sun from fading the carpet. The air is still and smells of lavender and dust.
You have read all the books you are allowed to read. You have embroidered every pillow. There is nothing to do.
Your mind begins to race, simply to have something to do. Your heart beats faster. You feel like you want to scream, just to break the silence. And then, the doctor arrives.
He takes your pulse.
He looks at your flushed face.
He shakes his head solemnly.
Hysteria, he says. You need more rest. The irony is palpable. The cure for the boredom was more boredom. As we prepare to close this segment of our journey, we are standing on the edge of a major shift. The Victorian era is about to give way to the 20th century. The rest cure is about to reach its peak, and then its breaking point. In our next segment, we will delve into the specific, personal story of the rest cure and the woman who destroyed it with a short story. We will walk through the yellow wallpapered room. We will also examine the rise of the chemical cures, the mother's little helpers, the tonics laced with opium and alcohol that were sold in every pharmacy, promising to soothe the hysterical woman into a chemically induced peace. We will see how the invention of the vibrator moved from the doctor's office to the home, and how the definition of hysteria finally began to crumble under the weight of modern science and the feminist movement. But for now, leave the cold wet sheets and the magnetic taps behind.
You are not bound by these old remedies. You are free to move, or to stay still. You are free to feel whatever you feel. Let the history fade back into the books.
Let the dust settle. The room is quiet. The night is yours. Take a slow breath. Hold it for a moment, acknowledging the space in your chest, and then let it go. We return to the most infamous of all the hysteria treatments we have discussed, the rest cure.
As mentioned previously, the champion of this method was Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, a Philadelphia neurologist.
He was a celebrated figure, a man of letters and science, and his cure was embraced by the American and European elite as the standard of care for any woman suffering from nerves, depression, or chronic fatigue.
The rest cure was not a gentle suggestion to relax.
It was a rigorous, authoritarian regime designed to completely strip the patient of her intellectual and physical autonomy.
Imagine a spacious, yet sterile, bedroom.
Heavy drapes block the light. The furniture is large and dark. You are put to bed, and you are not allowed to leave it for any reason.
Weeks turn into months. You are not allowed to sit up. You are not allowed to feed yourself.
But the most crushing restrictions were the prohibitions on mental activity.
No reading, no writing, and no intellectual conversation.
The doctor's philosophy was that the woman's brain was too active, too stimulated, and that her feminine reproductive organs had somehow drained her nervous energy. The cure, therefore, was to shut down the brain entirely, allowing the body to passively collect and regenerate its nervous fluid. Picture the sensory experience of this forced stillness. The only sound is the rhythmic, almost punishing ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. You lie flat, gazing at the ceiling. The heavy blankets press down on you.
You are force-fed a high-fat diet, often excessive amounts of milk and cream to build up what Mitchell called good blood.
This forced weight gain and forced immobility were intended to make the woman passive, bovine, and utterly dependent on the caregiver. The goal was to erase the adult, thinking woman and replace her with a compliant, quiet child. The result of this psychological and physical imprisonment was often a deepening of the very depression and anxiety it was meant to cure.
Many women emerged from the rest cure weaker, heavier, and closer to madness than when they entered.
And this brings us to the profound and lasting legacy of Charlotte Perkins Gilman.
Gilman was a brilliant writer and feminist thinker who, in the late 1880s, suffered a nervous breakdown after the birth of her daughter.
She consulted Dr. Weir Mitchell himself, who prescribed the rest cure.
She followed his instructions meticulously. For one agonizing month, she lay still.
She was forbidden to read or write.
As she later recounted, she became terrified that she would go completely insane. She felt her very self, her identity as a creative, thinking person being suffocated. When she was finally released, Mitchell gave her the now infamous instruction: live as domestic a life as possible. Have but 2 hours intellectual life a day.
And never touch pen, brush, or pencil again. Gilman ignored him.
She knew that to follow his orders would be to sign her own death warrant.
Instead, she did the only thing she could do to survive. She penned the chilling short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. In the story, a narrator suffering from temporary nervous depression is taken to a secluded house and placed on a strict rest cure by her physician husband.
She is confined to an upstairs nursery room with paper that is torn, scratched, and an offensively, confusingly patterned yellow.
Imagine looking at that wallpaper through the drowsy fatigue of forced inactivity. The color is not a cheerful yellow, but a sickly, sulfur yellow. The pattern is confusing.
It shifts and irritates the eye.
It seems to move. The room smells of the wallpaper's strange, deep, unsettling odor. The narrator, starved of intellectual stimulation, slowly begins to project her own anxiety and frustration onto the pattern. She sees a woman trapped behind the bars of the design.
The pattern becomes the physical representation of her confinement.
The more she is told to rest and do nothing, the more she obsesses over freeing the trapped woman.
It is a slow, quiet descent into madness, caused not by the illness itself, but by the cure. Gilman famously sent a copy of the story to Dr. Mitchell.
He never publicly acknowledged it, but he reportedly changed some aspects of his treatment later on. The yellow wallpaper became a quiet, powerful bomb dropped into the heart of Victorian medicine, exposing the rest cure as a form of social control designed to subdue intelligent women.
Now, let us turn our attention away from the severe structure of the sanatorium and towards the small, easily accessible bottles found on the kitchen shelves of every American and European home.
This is the era of patent medicines and soothing tonics. If the rest cure was for the elite, the tonics were for the anxious masses. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, pharmacies and grocery stores were filled with bottles promising to cure female complaint, nervous debility, or the general blues. These medicines offered a quiet, chemical peace. Imagine a tiny, dark glass bottle, wrapped in a bright, optimistic paper label. The label features a calm-looking woman with perfect hair. The advertisement copy promises relief from headaches, weakness, fainting, and melancholy. It assures the husband that his wife will be calm, happy, and compliant. What was in these soothing elixirs?
Often, they contained alarming amounts of alcohol, sometimes as high as 40%. Making them stronger than whiskey. They were laced with powerful, addictive narcotics that were legal and unregulated at the time. Opium, morphine, and, in some cases, cocaine were common ingredients.
Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, for example, was one of the most popular. It was given to nervous women, and often to crying babies, and it was primarily a mixture of morphine and alcohol. The woman would take a spoonful, and the symptoms of hysteria, the racing heart, the panic, the frustration would simply sink into a deep, chemical quiet. This was the perfect temporary cure for the symptoms of confinement and boredom. It was easy, it was cheap,
and it was socially acceptable. A woman could become addicted to a powerful narcotic, and her condition would simply be chalked up to her delicate nerves. The anxiety was masked by the calm of the drug.
The irony here is profound.
Doctors were prescribing months of isolation and painful procedures to treat anxiety, while women were simultaneously self-medicating with highly addictive substances bought over the counter.
The underlying problem of stifled autonomy remained untouched, just chemically smoothed over.
This commercial spirit of quick, domestic relief brings us to another great Victorian invention, the vibrator at home.
In our last segment, we discussed the massive, steam-powered machines used by doctors to induce a hysterical paroxysm.
By the 1890s and 1900 seconds, with the spread of residential electricity, these machines were quickly miniaturized.
The home vibrator was not sold with any suggestion of pleasure. It was sold purely as a medical device, a cure-all for domestic ailments.
Imagine opening a heavy, glassy catalogue, perhaps Sears Roebuck.
The device is advertised next to the electric fan, the vacuum cleaner, and the heating pad.
The copy promises quick relief from headaches, poor digestion, back pain, and most importantly, nervousness and female trouble.
The device was used by women to stimulate their muscles and nerves. The buzzing sound, the tactile sensation, it was believed to stimulate the circulation and relax the tension in the same way the water cure did, but in the comfort and privacy of one's own home. The quiet, contained buzzing of the electric motor was the soundtrack to a new, modern form of self-treatment. This transition from a doctor's hand to a personal appliance was a form of quiet, unintended liberation. Women could now access the cure without the tedious, embarrassing, and expensive trips to the physician's office. By the time the 20th century turned the corner, hysteria was still the diagnosis, but the means of managing it had moved firmly into the domestic sphere. The treatment was now rest, chemical sedation, and electric massage. This is a powerful moment in our story. The diagnosis of hysteria is now deeply woven into the fabric of daily life.
It is not just an illness,
It is an industry.
but forces were gathering to tear down the entire structure of the diagnosis.
The early 20th century saw the rise of psychoanalysis, which, while flawed, insisted that mental suffering was housed in the mind, not in the womb. The suffrage movement was gaining ground, demanding that women's intellectual energy be released into the world, not suffocated in a room with yellow wallpaper. And slowly but surely, the science itself began to change. In our next segment, we will address the final long decline of the diagnosis.
We will look at the psychological shift from Freud to the modern era. The influence of the world was on the perception of nervous illness in both men and women, and the quiet, almost unnoticed moment when the medical community finally decided to retire the word hysteria from its official
books. We will watch as the scientific world finally catches up to the reality that anxiety and depression are human conditions, not gender-specific curses.
But for now, let the buzzing fade.
Let the memory of the heavy blankets and the sickly yellow walls soften.
You are in a quiet, safe place, far from the rules and prescriptions of the past.
Just settle deeper into the calm. Let your breath become slow and even. The story will wait for you. Take a slow, deep breath, and let the silence of the room settle around you.
We are moving now into the twilight of our history, approaching the modern age.
We have seen the wandering womb, the burning of witches, the theatricality of Mesmer, and the suffocating stillness of the rest cure. Now, we will witness the slow, deliberate dismantling of the diagnosis itself.
As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the primary battleground for the understanding of hysteria shifted from the doctor's clinic to the psychologist's couch.
And the central figure, as we briefly noted, was Sigmund Freud.
Freud's contribution was revolutionary in one crucial way. He moved the illness out of the uterus and into the mind.
Working in Vienna,
a city of ornate cafes and intellectual ferment, Freud and his colleagues observed that many patients, particularly women labeled hysterical, did not respond to the physical cures. They noticed that their symptoms, such as paralysis, blindness, or persistent pain, had no physical cause that could be detected under a microscope.
Freud developed the concept of the unconscious mind. He posited that the symptoms of hysteria were not the product of a physical illness, but a physical manifestation of a psychological conflict that had been repressed. He theorized that deeply traumatic memories, often centered around childhood, were too painful for the conscious mind to bear.
So, the mind converted the emotional pain into a physical symptom, a process he called conversion.
Imagine the pressure building inside a bottle.
If you don't release the pressure by uncorking the top, the bottle will find a weak point and the pressure will escape there.
For Freud, the physical body was that weak point. The paralysis was the body's way of expressing a repressed thought. I cannot move forward. I am trapped. His famous method, psychoanalysis, involved lying on a couch in a quiet, lamplit room and talking freely, allowing the unconscious mind to speak through free association. The goal was to bring the repressed trauma to the surface, into the light of consciousness, which would, in theory, cause the physical symptom to disappear. Freud's quiet office, with its Turkish rugs and velvet cushions, was a stark contrast to the clanking steam machines of the Victorian doctor. The treatment was now about listening, not shocking.
However, while Freud was a step away from the misogyny of the wandering womb, he introduced a different set of gender biases. His famous Oedipus complex and his theories about penis envy deeply colored his analysis of women. He tended to view female development as a struggle to accept an inferior, passive role. So, while he acknowledged that the mind was the source of the suffering, he often concluded that the woman's suffering was a result of her own failure to fulfill her prescribed feminine role.
The anxiety was still her fault.
It was just a psychological fault instead of a biological one. This new psychological framework continued to dominate the early 20th century, keeping the diagnosis of hysteria alive, but under the new name of conversion disorder or hysterical neurosis.
But the world was about to be rocked by events so massive. They would forever alter the understanding of nervous disease. The world was. The trenches of World War I and the massive air raids of World War II produced a staggering number of men suffering from what was called shell shock. Imagine this scene. A young soldier, far from the drawing rooms and quiet parlors of civilian life, is subjected to non-stop noise, the constant vibration of artillery, the fear, and the death. He returns from the front unable to speak, trembling uncontrollably or suffering from temporary paralysis, the very same physical symptoms that had been labeled hysteria in women for centuries. But no one called the soldier hysterical in men. These symptoms were recognized as a legitimate, devastating injury caused by the war, a profound reaction to overwhelming trauma. It was an honorable illness. It was a failure of the environment, not a failure of the gender. The medical establishment was forced to confront the truth. If a man could develop paralysis or tremors due to external stress, then the theory that these symptoms were exclusive to women as defective uteruses or deep-seated feminine repression had to be fundamentally wrong. Stress, trauma, and a psychological wound could clearly manifest as a physical disease in any human being. This was a pivotal, quiet victory for the truth. The trauma of war, while tragic, provided irrefutable proof that hysteria was not a woman's disease, but a human response to extreme pressure. As we move into the post-war world, the field of psychiatry began to blossom, driven by this new understanding of trauma and the rise of biochemical research. The new tools were no longer steam baths or Mesmer's wands. They were pills. The 1950s and 60 seconds ushered in the age of psychopharmacology. Scientists began to understand the role of neurotransmitters serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine in mood and anxiety. They learned that depression was not a moral failing or a wandering vapor, but a complex chemical imbalance in the brain. This led to the development of the first anti-anxiety and antidepressant medications, often referred to in the culture as mother's little helpers. These were the tranquilizers, most famously Valium and Librium. They provided fast, effective relief from anxiety symptoms. Suddenly, a doctor no longer had to perform a manual procedure or prescribe months of debilitating rest. They could prescribe a small white pill. Imagine the sheer, quiet relief this must have been for women who had suffered for so long. They were finally receiving treatment aimed at the brain, not the womb. But the social context remained. The pills were often overprescribed to women in stifling domestic situations. While the chemical cause was addressed, the social caused the boredom, the lack of autonomy. The pressure was not. A woman could be chemically calm while still trapped in a yellow wallpaper room. It was during this time, the 1960s and 70s, that the feminist movement launched its final decisive attack on the diagnosis of hysteria. Writers and activists began to expose how medicine had been used as a tool of social control. They argued that the diagnosis of hysteria was simply a way of pathologizing female dissent. If a woman was unhappy with her life, demanding change, or feeling depressed, the diagnosis provided a way to dismiss her valid complaints as irrational illness. The feminist critique was simple. It's not hysteria, it's oppression. This cultural pressure, combined with the hard science of the brain, led to the diagnosis's final, quiet collapse. In 1980, when the American Psychiatric Association published the third edition of its diagnostic manual, the DSM-3, the word hysterical neurosis was officially removed. The symptoms it once described were scattered into other, more specific, and non-gendered categories: conversion disorder, somatization disorder, and borderline personality disorder. The word was retired. The wandering womb had finally been nailed down, but the legacy of hysteria remains. We still use the word today, not as a medical diagnosis, but as a cultural weapon, a way to dismiss someone's emotions as exaggerated or irrational. When a public figure is accused of being hysterical, it carries the 2,000-year-old echo of the Greek physicians, the message that their feelings are merely a biological malfunction, not a valid response to the world. So, as we bring this final segment to a close, let the full scope of this journey settle within you. We have traveled from the stone temples of Hippocrates, through the dark asylums of the Victorians, to the modern clinic. We have witnessed a diagnosis that survived for 2 millennia, a diagnosis that proved to be more of a cultural myth than a scientific fact. The story of hysteria is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most important cure is not a medical procedure, but simply being listened to and believed. Now, as the long, quiet history fades, you are here, in this moment, in the comfort of your own space. There is nothing to fix, nothing to control, and nowhere for your mind to wander but into a deep and peaceful rest. Let the final thoughts of this history drift away like smoke. All is quiet. Take a moment to let the stillness of the night settle around you. We are continuing our journey into the quiet echoes of medical history. And now,
Having explored the end of the hysteria diagnosis, we must return to a pivotal moment that cemented its cultural power. Late 19th century Paris. We are traveling back to the year 1870.
To one of the most famous medical institutions in the world, the Salpêtrière Hospital. This was not just a hospital.
It was an enormous complex, a massive former women's prison that had been converted into an asylum and teaching clinic. Imagine a sprawling, ancient compound, quiet corridors leading to dimly lit wards, and the faint, pervasive scent of soap and carbolic acid lingering in the air. At the center of this world was a man known as the father of modern neurology, Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot.
Charcot was a brilliant and exacting observer. He did not dismiss the hysterical patients as moral failures or wandering wombs.
He saw them as subjects worthy of serious scientific study.
He wanted to categorize their symptoms, to define them, and to prove that hysteria was a real neurological condition, even if its cause remained psychological. Picture the scene of his famous Tuesday lectures. These were spectacles, almost theatrical performances, held in a grand circular amphitheater. Medical students, esteemed colleagues, and curious members of the Parisian elite would gather to watch. In the center of the amphitheater, Charcot would present his patients. These were often women from the hospital wards who were famous for their dramatic fits, their temporary paralysis, or their strange, sudden seizures. He would call them up, sometimes hypnotize them, and induce or halt their hysterical symptoms right there on stage. Charcot essentially codified the 4 distinct phases of the hysterical attack: the epileptoid phase, convulsions and muscle spasms; the clowning phase, erratic movements and dramatic postures; the passionate attitudes phase, postures that resembled emotional states, terror, ecstasy, or supplication; the delirious phase, hallucinations and verbal confusion. This was a quiet tragedy unfolding in a public setting. These women, many of whom were poor, uneducated, and institutionalized, found themselves suddenly famous. They were the stars of a medical drama. The relationship between Charcot and his patients was complex and often troubling. The women, conscious or unconsciously, knew exactly what was expected of them. They performed their symptoms for the great doctor, and in return, they received attention, better food, and a sense of purpose. The environment itself created the illness. It became a feedback loop. Charcot searched for specific symptoms, and the patients, eager to please or to gain notice, would manifest those symptoms. Imagine the atmosphere in that amphitheater. The hush of the crowd, the scraping of the students' pens on their notebooks, the intense gaze of Charcot, and the woman on the stage, her body contorted into an impossible pose under the pressure of the moment. The power of suggestion was almost palpable. 2 of Charcot's most famous patients were Augustine and Blanche Whitman. Augustine became iconic. She was a young woman whose photographic portraits taken at the Salpêtrière were widely circulated. In these photographs, she had shown mid-attack, her body arched backward in what was called the arc du cercle, or the arc of the circle. Picture the slow, clicking shutter of the camera in that quiet, clinical setting. The bright magnesium flash temporarily illuminates the stark hospital room. Augustine holds the posture, knowing this image will be studied by doctors around the world. These photographs were collected into a book, the Iconographie photographique de la Salpêtrière. This book became the definitive visual atlas of hysteria. The photographs were intended to be scientific proof that hysteria followed a predictable pattern. But what they really proved was the power of visual media to enforce a diagnosis. By showing the world exactly what a hysterical woman looked like, Charcot taught every doctor and every woman how to behave when they were sick. The symptoms became universal, not because of a biological cause, but because of a shared reference book. As we shift our focus from the stage to the laboratory, let us look at the ancient and persistent use of chemical compounds to manage female ailments. Before the age of Freud and before the cameras of Charcot, medicine relied on herbal remedies, and these often led to slow, quiet forms of chemical dependence. Think back to the ancient world. The Greeks used strong-smelling herbs and compounds to repel or attract the wandering womb. But they also employed sedatives. One of the oldest and most persistent herbal remedies was mandragora or mandrake. This plant contains potent alkaloids atropine and scopolamine, which act as powerful sedatives and hallucinogens. It was used to quiet pain and to soothe agitation of the spirit. Administered quietly in a tea, it offered a deep, dreamlike sleep, a welcome escape from the anxieties of the time. Now, imagine the scent of the Roman pharmacy. The air is thick with herbs and oils.
Physicians were already mixing their own tonics for anxiety. These were the precursors to the Victorian patent medicines.
They would often use compounds derived from poppy, which contains opium mixed with wine or honey, for centuries. The easiest cure for a woman's emotional distress was a chemical compound that simply dulled her senses and forced her body into a state of quiet submission.
It was an involuntary rest cure, administered in a cup.
This practice continued unabated into the 18th and 19th centuries, eventually leading to widespread, quiet opium and laudanum dependency among women. Laudanum was opium dissolved in alcohol. It was easily purchased and prescribed for everything from menstrual cramps to emotional distress. Picture a woman sitting by the fire in her quiet home. The only way she can find peace from the crushing boredom of her life, or the pain of her physical existence, is to take a small spoonful of the dark, syrupy liquid. The taste is bitter, but the effect is immediate. A slow, heavy wave of calm washes over her.
The anxiety is gone.
The world is muted. This slow, pervasive chemical quieting of the female population is a dark thread that runs through the history of hysteria. It suggests that if a woman couldn't be controlled by social rules or strange procedures, she could always be controlled by chemistry. The women photographed by Charcot, the women drinking laudanum, and the women confined to the rest cure were all fighting the same battle, a world that refused to acknowledge that their pain was legitimate and that their emotional needs were real.
They were all finding ways to cope in a system that offered them either theatrical display or chemical silence.
As we conclude this segment, let the images of the Salptii fade. The camera has stopped clicking. The stage is empty.
The heavy silence of the hospital rooms returns. We are left with the profound realization that the most difficult part of the cure was the expectation that the woman must perform her illness for the approval of the man in charge.
In our next segment, we will delve deeper into the pharmacology of the 20th century. We will look at the rise of the barbiturates, the benzodiazepines, and the marketing campaigns that solidified the idea of the perpetually anxious female consumer, the direct descendant of the hysteric.
We will also explore the rise of shock therapies and lobotomy, treatments that were aimed at eradicating the hysterical personality entirely. For now, allow the subtle imagery of the past to become part of your drifting thoughts. There is nothing but stillness here. The quiet is a comfort, not a command. Let us settle once more into the quiet of our journey. We are moving into the early to mid-20th century, a time of massive technological and scientific advancement.
But for the woman still burdened by the diagnosis of hysteria, these advancements often manifested as cures that were startlingly severe or deceptively soothing. We begin with the quiet substitution of one chemical dependence for another.
As the dangers and toxicity of opium and laudanum became undeniable, the medical world enthusiastically embraced a new class of synthetic sedatives, the barbiturates. Imagine the transition.
The herbal bitterness of laudanum is replaced by the neat, sterile precision of a pharmaceutical pill.
These drugs, first introduced in the early 1900s, compounds like veron and phenobarbital, were lauded as a miracle cure for nervous insomnia and agitation. For the woman exhibiting classic hysterical symptoms, the inability to sleep, the racing thoughts, the inexplicable physical pains, barbiturates offered a profound synthetic peace.
They acted as powerful depressants on the central nervous system, forcing the brain into a state of deep, heavy quiet. Picture the bedside table of a restless woman in the 1930s. Next to her carafe of water sits a small, pale bottle of tablets. The doctor has assured her they are safe. She takes one, and the noise of her inner turmoil simply ceases.
The quiet is absolute. It is the enforced stillness of the rest cure, delivered invisibly through a pill.
While these drugs provided immediate relief from acute anxiety, they carried a heavy, hidden cost. They were highly addictive, and the body rapidly built up tolerance. Overdose, often accidental, sometimes intentional, became a quiet epidemic as women continually increased their dosage, seeking that initial deep, silent rest. The use of barbiturates within the asylum walls was even more severe. They were used as a form of chemical restraint, ensuring that the wards remained quiet and the patients passive.
A woman prone to outbursts or emotional fits could be kept in a perpetual state of slow, sleepy compliance.
It was a silent, continuous form of the rest cure, but even as barbiturates quieted the nerves, some physicians believed that emotional disorders were so deeply rooted that they required the most extreme intervention imaginable: surgery.
This brings us to one of the darkest, most tragic chapters in all of medical history: the lobotomy.
In the mid-1930s, the Portuguese neurologist Egues Moniz developed a procedure called the prefrontal leucotomy, and for this, he was later awarded the Nobel Prize.
The theory was simple though terrifying. Mental illness, including severe hysteria, was caused by fixed, repetitive, and debilitating thought patterns.
By surgically severing the nerve fibers that connect the frontal lobes, the center of judgment and planning, to the thalamus, the center of emotional signal processing, they hope to break the cycle of obsessive thought. Imagine the sterile silence of the operating theater in the 1940s.
The instruments are polished metal.
The air is cold. The most infamous popularizer of the procedure was the American Dr. Walter Freeman.
He toured the country in what he called his lobotomobile, performing the procedure quickly and often carelessly. He eventually pioneered the transorbital lobotomy, using a simple ice pick-like instrument.
Picture this chilling method. The patient is given a light anesthetic.
The physician lifts the patient's eyelid and drives the instrument through the thin bone of the eye socket into the brain.
Then, he gently moves the instrument back and forth to sever the connection. The entire procedure takes mere minutes for women diagnosed with intractable hysteria, those who are considered too rebellious, too anxious, or too difficult for chemical management. The lobotomy was offered as a last resort, a radical promise of peace.
The results were unpredictable and often catastrophic.
In successful cases, the patient would emerge quiet, calm, and no longer tormented by their severe anxiety.
But they were often left emotionally flat, docile, and childlike.
They had been cured of their pain, but at the cost of their personality. The life and fire, the very complexity that made them human, was surgically removed. The lobotomy was the most literal fulfillment of the idea that the woman's mind needed to be silenced. It was the absolute final word in the bizarre history of controlling female emotion. However, the tide was about to turn again due to the rapid advancement of pharmaceutical science.
The 1950s saw the development of the benzodiazepines, which completely changed the landscape of anxiety treatment. This was the era of the modern tranquilizer. In 1960, Librium was introduced. In 1963 came its successor, Valium. These drugs were chemically different from barbiturates.
They were less sedating and had a wider safety margin, offering relief specifically from anxiety and panic without immediately rendering the user unconscious. Imagine the slick, hopeful advertising of the 1960s.
The print ads show a harried, overwhelmed housewife in her kitchen. The copy is subtle. She copes with life better when she is calm. Valium, often called Mother's Little Helper, became the most widely prescribed drug in the Western world.
The pill was the perfect solution for the persistent, low-grade neurasthenia that still plagued women constrained by mid-century domesticity. If the husband felt the wife was too emotional, too nervous, or too unhappy with her lot, the doctor could hand her a prescription for Valium, confirming that her dissatisfaction was a medical problem, not a social one. The diagnosis of hysterical neurosis survived in the DSM largely because there was now a convenient pill to manage its symptoms. The chemical quiet was now safer and more socially pervasive than ever before.
Yet, this chemical dependence created a new problem.
Women were not cured.
They were chemically stabilized.
The addiction rate was enormous, leading to a generation that was subtly subdued by prescription. This widespread cultural use of tranquilizers was one of the final nails in the coffin of the old diagnosis. The ease of prescription and the sheer number of people, men and women, being treated for anxiety made the old gender term hysteria seem archaic and insufficient.
By the 1970s, the feminist critique of the medical establishment combined with growing awareness of the dangers of tranquilizer dependency forced a major reckoning.
The evidence from the world was the horror of the lobotomy and the ubiquity of Mother's Little Helper all pointed to one simple fact: anxiety and trauma were universal, and the historical focus on the female anatomy was pure, misogynistic superstition. This entire bizarre arc, from the migrating uterus to the surgical severance of the frontal lobe, finally ended in that quiet, unassuming moment in 1980, when the DSM-3 was published.
The former word was gone. The irony is that the most dangerous, bizarre cues, the lobotomy, the severe barbiturate doses, were often applied when the woman's symptoms were most disruptive to society.
The quiet chemical cures, laudanum, Valium, were for the women who were quietly suffering, ensuring they remained quiet. In both cases, the goal was the same: to silence the noise of female discontent.
As we draw this segment to a close, let us leave the bright, sterile rooms of the 20th century clinic
The terrible buzzing of the lobotomy machine has stopped. The pill bottles are put away. You are safe here, in the present, far removed from the sharp edges of history.
All that remains is the deep, peaceful quiet of the night. Allow your mind to drift away from the complexities of the past and sink into the simple comfort of rest.
Let us allow the noise of the 20th century to recede once more. We return to a quiet contemplation of the individuals whose lives were defined and often confined by the diagnosis of hysteria.
We are looking at the case files of history, re-examining the stories of the famous and the forgotten with a modern, more compassionate eye. For centuries, hysteria served as the ultimate diagnostic catch-all, a medical black hole that swallowed any illness that did not conform to the physician's understanding of the body. When a person, usually a woman, presented with symptoms that were real but inexplicable, the mind was blamed. Let us start with a figure revered for her strength and determination, Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale is famously known as the founder of modern nursing, the lady with the lamp, a woman of immense organizational and moral force.
But after her grueling work organizing military hospitals during the Crimean War in the 1850s, she returned home and became an invalid.
Imagine her small, quiet room in London. She was often confined to her bed or sofa for decades, suffering from fevers, exhaustion, and chronic, severe pain.
She was rarely able to leave the house. Yet from that room, she ran the British healthcare system. She wrote massive, influential reports, corresponded with world leaders, and reformed public sanitation. Her medical peers often dismissed her condition as hysteria or neurasthenia. They whispered that she was a delicate woman who simply couldn't handle the strain of intellectual work. Her physical suffering was seen as a way of demanding attention or avoiding social obligations she found tiresome. But looking back today, modern doctors and historians suggest a far more plausible diagnosis. Brucellosis, a bacterial infection caught in the filthy Crimean hospitals, or a severe form of chronic fatigue syndrome (MCFs). These are real, physical, debilitating conditions. The tragedy of Nightingale's story is a microcosm of the entire history of hysteria. A powerful, intelligent woman suffers from a real physical ailment that is not yet understood by science.
Because she is also intellectually vibrant and resists the expected domestic role, her physical pain is immediately translated into a psychological failing.
The illness was real, but the diagnosis was fictitious. Picture the slow scratching of her pen on paper, the only sound in the room. She is physically confined, but mentally, she is conquering a worldwide plague of poor sanitation. And yet, the world sees only the delicate hysteric on the couch. Now, let us turn to the heartbreaking case of Fanny Dickens.
Fanny Dickens was the beloved sister of the famous author Charles Dickens.
She was not famous in her own right, but her suffering illustrates how hysteria was often used to misdiagnose and erase profound, systemic physical problems.
Fanny suffered from a series of severe, chronic, and debilitating ailments throughout her life: constant pain, fatigue, and muscle weakness. When her symptoms worsened, her doctors were quick to use the familiar labels.
They decided her illness was an emotional or nervous condition.
Her anxiety, her emotionality, and her general dissatisfaction with her condition was cited as the cause, not the effect.
In her later life, she died at a young age, and the official cause of death was vague, likely complicated by the lack of effective treatment for her underlying issues. Modern analysis of her symptoms strongly suggests she may have been suffering from tuberculosis or a severe form of multiple sclerosis (MS), progressive neurological diseases that manifest with exactly the kind of vague, debilitating symptoms that doctors were trained to call hysteria. The doctors of the time were not trained to look for subtle neurological degradation. They were trained to look for the arc de circle. And so, a real, physical, life-threatening illness was quietly allowed to progress, masked by a psychological label. The woman was blamed for the very disease that was killing her. The quiet, insidious harm of the diagnosis was that it provided a medical alibi for ignorance. If a doctor couldn't find the cause, the answer was always hysteria, and the problem was neatly returned to the patient's own fragile mind. Let us consider a group of historical figures often labeled as hysterics, but who are now understood to have been suffering from bipolar disorder or epilepsy. Think of the emotional extremes of the so-called manic hysteric. These were women who experienced periods of intense, sometimes frenzied activity, followed by deep, immobilizing depression.
Their mood swings were dramatic and unpredictable.
In the 18th and 19th centuries, this was proof of an unbalanced mind driven by the rebellious womb. They were often locked away for being too loud, too creative, or too intense. They were subjected to cold baths and spinning chairs to physically recenter their fluids and balance their humors. Today, the regularity and severity of these cycles are the hallmarks of bipolar disorder, a complex but manageable condition of the brain's chemistry.
The bizarre cures they endured were completely unrelated to the chemical cause of their suffering. Similarly, women suffering from epilepsy were frequently misdiagnosed as hysterics. Epilepsy involves sudden, often dramatic seizures and convulsions. When a woman fell into a fit, the doctor often struggled to distinguish it from the clowning face of Charcot's hysteria model.
The difference was subtle but profound.
A true epileptic seizure follows a fixed physiological pattern and is involuntary. A true hysterical attack was often responsive to suggestion, stopping if the audience left the room.
But in the chaos of a busy hospital or the fear of a home visit, physicians often defaulted to the hysteria diagnosis, which was morally easier to handle than a complex neurological disorder. The result: epileptic women were denied early, effective treatments like the use of barbiturates which could control seizures, and were instead subjected to therapies designed to control their will, such as the rest cure or isolation,
making their underlying physical condition worse. The sheer volume of these misdiagnoses is what ultimately led to the crumbling of the term.
The medical community gradually realized that a single diagnosis could not possibly cover multiple sclerosis, Fanny Dickens's likely illness, chronic fatigue syndrome, Florence Nightingale's likely illness, epilepsy.
Bipolar disorder, actual psychological trauma, as Freud later argued, simple boredom and social restraint. It wasn't a diagnosis. It was a junk drawer for medical uncertainty.
As we conclude this segment, we are left with a quiet sense of the resilience of these women. They were ill, often profoundly so, but they survived the double trauma. The trauma of the physical illness, and the trauma of the medical system's profound misunderstanding.
They kept writing, kept thinking, and kept trying to communicate their genuine pain, even when the only language society allowed them was the language of hysteria.
The quiet voices of these forgotten patients, the rustle of Nightingale's papers, the muffled sobs in the asylum, these are the final echoes of the bizarre cure.
They remind us that the greatest cure is always simple humility on the part of the physician, and a willingness to listen to the patient. Truly listen, without preconception. Let this reflection guide you now into a deeper state of calm.
The past has settled into history.
You are comfortable, supported, and free from the gaze of the diagnosing eye.
Rest now. Settle deeper into your comfort. We are now delving into the quiet history of surgical interventions, treatments that remind us how seriously and how tragically the medical establishment took the idea that female anxiety was a physical disease requiring a physical eradication in the late 19th century. At the same time, Dr. Charcot was staging his dramatic lectures in Paris. Some physicians in England and America reached a chilling conclusion. If the womb was the problem, and if medicines couldn't quiet it, the only logical step was to remove the source of irritation entirely. This led to the practice of the oophorectomy, the surgical removal of one or both ovaries. The prevailing logic, though steeped in misogyny, was simple.
The ovaries were seen as the seat of female identity, emotion, and, crucially, instability. If a woman was deemed irrecoverably hysterical, too rebellious, or prone to excessive emotional outbursts, what the Victorians called nymphomania or satyriasis, the radical solution was to essentially spay the hysteric, rendering her docile and emotionally neutral.
Imagine the quiet desperation of the operating theatre.
Anesthesia was available, but procedures were still risky.
The surgery was often performed in less than sterile conditions, leading to high rates of infection and death. The doctors who championed this practice argued that they were saving the woman's mind by sacrificing her organs. They reported miraculous cures in their journals, claiming that the removal of the ovaries restored women to a state of calm, domestic tranquility. But the reality for many patients was brutal. Chronic pain, premature menopause, and often no improvement in their mental state at all. Their hysteria, of course, was never truly physical, and thus could not be cut out with a scalpel. This practice reveals the deep-seated fear of female sexuality and autonomy that was woven into the fabric of the hysteria diagnosis.
The bizarre cure was a permanent, irreversible silencing of the patient's biological and emotional core.
The physical trauma of the surgery was considered a lesser evil than the persistent presence of an outspoken or unstable mind. Draining the vapors, leeching and cupping let us now step back slightly in time to examine older remedies that persisted right alongside the advent of radical surgery. Therapeutic bleeding. For thousands of years, the medical world was dominated by the humoral theory, which believed the body was governed by four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Hysteria, like many illnesses, was often attributed to an excess of blood or an imbalance of the humors, particularly the black bile. To restore balance and calm the agitated nerves of the hysteric, the doctor would prescribe bloodletting. This practice continued actively into the mid-19th century, a strange juxtaposition of ancient belief and modern practice. One common method was cupping. Picture the sensory experience of this treatment. The doctor applies a small, bell-shaped glass cup to the patient's skin, often on the back of the neck or the spine, as these areas were believed to connect to the nervous system. The air inside the cup is heated, creating a vacuum. As the cup cools, it pulls the skin upward. In dry cupping, the aim was simply to draw blood to the surface to divert the bad humors, leaving large circular bruises. In wet cupping, the skin was lightly cut before the cup was applied, allowing a specific, quiet amount of blood to be drawn out. The copper and salt smell of blood would fill the air. Even more common was the use of leeches. Imagine a small, soft, quiet presence of the leech placed on the patient's temple or behind the ear. Leeches were particularly favored for nervous headaches or brain fever symptoms easily categorized as hysteria. The leech operates in silence, slowly draining the prescribed amount of blood. To the physician, this blood was carrying the toxins of agitation away, literally draining the hysteria out of the patient. While therapeutic bleeding sometimes provided a temporary sensation of lightness or relief, perhaps due to a drop in blood pressure or the placebo effect, it often simply left the patient weaker, more susceptible to infection, and still suffering from the underlying psychological or physical ailment. Yet, it was a calm, methodical, accepted ritual for hundreds of years. Finally, let us examine another bizarre physical intervention: the practice of counter-irritation. This theory held that if an internal organ was diseased or agitated, creating an external source of pain would draw the body's attention and corrupt humors away from the internal problem. It was a crude, painful form of distraction. The most insidious method of counter-irritation was the Seton needle. Picture a heavy, curved surgical needle, carrying a piece of silk, cotton, or horsehair thread. The physician would pierce a fold of skin often on the arm, neck, or back and draw the thread through, leaving a loop of the foreign material under the skin. The thread was never removed. Every day, the patient would be instructed to slightly pull or move the thread. This deliberate movement kept the wound open, ensured chronic inflammation, and promoted the continuous drainage of pus. The constant, nagging pain and the sight of the draining wound were, in the bizarre logic of the time, proof that the body's bad humors were being successfully diverted from the internal organs. For the hysterical woman, the Seton was a constant, low-level physical punishment. It was a visible sign of her illness and a persistent reminder of her status as an invalid. It was a way to make her external body suffer for the supposed failures of her internal mind. All of these treatments, the surgical cut, the leech's suck, the draining wound, were rooted in the same fundamental principle: the belief that the body was intrinsically flawed, and that only a severe, intentional physical disruption could restore emotional balance. The bizarre cure was often far worse than the anxiety it was intended to treat. As we conclude this segment, allow the images of these difficult historical practices to soften. These are the last of the overtly physical, invasive cures we will focus on. The quiet suffering they represent is now safely sealed in the past. Settle down once more. We are about to travel far beyond the confines of the European clinic and the Victorian parlor. The central thesis of our journey, that hysteria was a diagnosis of convenience and social control, is best confirmed by examining how other cultures have created their own equally bizarre medical mysteries. The symptoms of deep anxiety and psychological distress do not occur in a vacuum. They are always shaped by the culture they arise in. What is seen as hysterical in one place might be viewed as a spiritual possession, a curse, or a social protest in another. This brings us to the concept of culture-bound syndromes. A culture-bound syndrome is a pattern of strange, distressing behavior or experience that is entirely understood and recognized within a specific cultural or geographic group,
but makes no sense outside of it. They are the local hysterias of the world. By quietly comparing these, we understand that the symptoms are simply a vocabulary chosen from a local dictionary of distress. Let us begin with a parallel to the ancient Greek concept of the wandering womb, the syndrome known as Koro. Koro is found predominantly in Southeast Asia, particularly in Malaysia, Indonesia, and parts of China.
While the ancient Greeks believed the womb would wander and cause trouble in women, Koro is primarily a diagnosis of male anxiety. Imagine the sudden, profound terror of a man in a quiet, humid room.
He becomes utterly convinced that his penis or testes are rapidly retracting into his abdomen, and that once the organ fully disappears, he will die. The fear is acute and overwhelming.
The physical symptoms are real sweating, trembling, and profound panic.
The bizarre cure is often for the patient to physically grasp his genitals, or to use clamps, sticks, or the help of family members to prevent the imagined retraction.
Koro is a profound, powerful manifestation of anxiety,
often linked to fears of coldness, sexual failure, or depletion of the body's essential life force.
It mirrors hysteria in its dramatic physical manifestation of an internal psychological terror.
But crucially, it is a male hysteria, proving that this kind of conversion disorder is entirely non-gendered in its potential and entirely cultural in its expression.
It is a language of distress chosen by a culture that places great emphasis on male potency, the male outburst, running amok. Another powerful cultural parallel to hysteria is found in Malay culture, the phenomenon known as amok. The term running amok has entered the English language, but its clinical definition is rooted in intense cultural pressure.
Amok is a sudden, unprovoked episode of violent, murderous rage, often directed at random people or objects, followed by exhaustion, depression, and often total amnesia regarding the event. Picture the slow, steady pressure building on a quiet, reserved man in a village. He may have suffered a deep personal insult, a loss of status, or a severe injustice.
In a culture that highly values emotional restraint and social harmony, he has no acceptable way to express his rage or humiliation. The pressure builds, silent and invisible, then the sudden break.
He grabs a weapon and runs out, causing carnage. The quiet, controlled man becomes a storm of violence. The bizarre cure, historically, was execution, or, if caught alive, severe restraint.
While hysteria was the passive language of female confinement expressed through paralysis, fainting, or quiet weeping amok was the active, violent language of male confinement and humiliation.
Both syndromes are safety valves for unbearable social pressure.
They show that anxiety, when suppressed by rigid social structures, finds an extreme, culturally defined way to burst out.
In the 19th century, European doctors observed amok and, unable to categorize it within their own framework, simply dismissed it as a barbaric, racialized form of madness.
They failed to see that amok was simply the loud, violent tween of their own quiet, fainting hysteria, the dance of desperation. Tarantism. Let us now return to Europe, to the southern hill of Italy, where we find a fascinating cultural response to anxiety. Tarantism.
This phenomenon peaked in the Middle Ages and early modern period.
It was the belief that a person bitten by a venomous spider called a tarantula was possessed by its venom. The only way to expel the poison was to engage in a frantic, exhausting, ecstatic dance. Imagine a dry, dusty square in a small Italian town.
A person, usually a young woman, collapses, perhaps suffering from deep depression or anxiety, what was called melancholy. A local musician is called. They begin to play the tarantella, a frenzied, rhythmic, high-energy piece of music. The patient is compelled to dance.
She whirls, she leaps, she thrashes, sometimes for days without stopping, until she collapses from sheer exhaustion. This physical frenzy, this exhaustion, was the cure.
The venom was believed to be sweated out.
But modern historians and medical anthropologists view tarantism as another form of collective motor hysteria, similar to the medieval dancing plagues we briefly discussed. In a highly restrictive traditional society, the dance was the only culturally acceptable way for women and sometimes men to release massive amounts of repressed energy, sexual frustration, or profound social tension.
The bizarre cure was not the music or the dance itself, but the permission granted by the cultural belief.
The spider bite gave the patient a sense to be loud, chaotic, and completely unrestrained, all the things a respectable woman was forbidden to be. The community did not condemn her. They organized the musicians and participated in the ritual, facilitating the collective release of tension. These global examples, the quiet terror of Koro, the violent eruption of Amok, and the exhausting dance of Tarantism, all teach us the same truth. Human anxiety is universal, but the language it speaks is local. The paralysis, the fainting, the fits, the seclusion, these were simply the cultural costumes that anxiety wore in 19th century Europe. The bizarre cure was simply the culturally sanctioned ritual designed to control that specific costume.
By understanding that hysteria was a culture-bound syndrome, we can finally fully retire the notion that it was ever a biological defect of the female sex.
It was a societal tragedy, misdiagnosed for 2 millennia. As we conclude this profound segment, let us internalize this final truth.
Your feelings, your fears, and your thoughts are valid.
They are not a defect of your body, but a response to your world.
You are safe now, understood, and free to simply rest in the knowledge of that truth.
We have watched the diagnosis of hysteria officially vanish from the medical manuals, but we must now acknowledge a crucial truth. The ghost of hysteria still haunts the halls of modern medicine. The bias that allowed physicians to dismiss real, unexplained female suffering as psychosomatic for 2,000 years did not simply disappear in 1980.
It merely changed its name.
The most profound modern echo of the old hysteria diagnosis can be found in a cluster of chronic debilitating illnesses that are vague,
difficult to diagnose, and predominantly affect women. Fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome, CFS, also known as myalgic encephalomyelitis (ME).
Imagine a woman today experiencing pervasive pain in her muscles and joints, profound exhaustion that is not relieved by sleep, and cognitive fog. She goes to doctor after doctor, and every test comes back negative.
Her physical suffering is immense, yet the lack of clear biomarkers of visible injury or blood abnormality leads to the familiar, quiet dismissal.
For decades, these syndromes were often labeled as yuppie flu, attributed to stress, or, most tellingly, defined as somatoform disorders, meaning the physical symptoms were believed to originate purely from psychological conflict, a direct, modern application of Freud's conversion theory. The same language once used for the hysteric was recycled. It is all in her head. She just needs to exercise more. She's emotionally fragile. This is the hidden tragedy of the diagnosis's legacy.
By failing to find a simple cause, doctors revert to the historical safety net of blaming the patient's psyche, particularly when the patient is a woman expressing pain.
The bias of the bedside, the persistence of this bias is borne out by quiet, pervasive studies on medical gaslighting. Imagine 2 patients, a man and a woman, arriving at an emergency room with identical symptoms of severe abdominal pain. Studies have consistently shown that the man is more likely to be treated aggressively for pain, often receiving strong narcotics, while the woman is more likely to wait longer, have her symptoms attributed to stress or emotional factors, and be offered mild sedatives or anti-anxiety medication. This is the ultimate modern realization of the bizarre cure dynamic. The woman is prescribed quiet, while the man is prescribed relief. The diagnosis of hysteria taught physicians to be skeptical of female suffering, to view women as inherently melodramatic or unreliable reporters of their own bodies.
This skepticism results in real, measurable harm today, delaying treatment for genuine conditions like heart disease, autoimmune disorders, and, yes, chronic pain syndromes. The ghost of the wandering womb is still whispering doubt into the stethoscope.
The triumph of specificity, but the final act of this story is a hopeful one, born from the very science that once failed these patients. Modern medical research is slowly, but powerfully dismantling the last echoes of hysteria through technology. Today, advanced neuroimaging techniques, such as functional MRI/fMR, are providing objective evidence for the physical reality of conditions once deemed psychosomatic. Imagine a woman with fibromyalgia undergoing a brain scan. Researchers can now observe that her brain is not normal, but is physically processing pain signals with an abnormal intensity. They can see changes in the gray matter density and altered connectivity in areas responsible for emotional regulation and pain perception.
The pain is not in her head in the sense of being imagined.
The pain is in her brain, where all pain is processed, and it is demonstrably real.
Similarly, research into CFS or ME is beginning to uncover specific biomarkers, abnormalities in natural killer cells, post-exertional malaise that correlates with measurable biological changes, and viral remnants.
the illness is being reclassified as a complex neurological and immunological disorder. This is the quiet, final victory against the diagnosis of hysteria. Science is replacing the word psychosomatic with neuroimmunological. The bizarre, generalized historical cure is being replaced by targeted, specific, and objective modern understanding. The ethical legacy, the ultimate lesson of the history of hysteria, is an ethical one. It teaches us to shift our medical perspective from a punitive, blaming stance to one of open curiosity and compassion. The old medical question was, what is wrong with this woman, that she is causing these problems?
The modern, humane question, often central to trauma-informed care, is what happened to this human being, and how did their body learn to cope with it?
This shift in language from blaming the individual to examining the system and the experience is the final, peaceful end to the legacy of hysteria. It acknowledges that the body and mind are not separate enemies, but an integrated whole, expressing distress in the only language available to them.
As we bring this initial 10-part journey to a conclusion, let us recognize that the history of hysteria is not just a tale of bad medicine, but a powerful reminder of the deep human need to be seen, to be believed, and to be treated with dignity.
You are not a diagnosis from the past. You are a complete, integrated person in the present. Let the knowledge of this journey settle within you, bringing not anxiety, but quiet contemplation and deep rest. Let us allow our exploration to slow down, focusing the lens of history onto a single treatment that perfectly encapsulates the medical control of the late 19th century. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell's Rest Cure. We will now examine this treatment not as a historical footnote, but as a total experience of silence and subjugation. Dr. Weir Mitchell was, by all accounts, a figure of immense authority in America.
A novelist, a poet, and a preeminent neurologist, he operated with an unchallenged confidence. When he spoke, the medical world listened, and for decades, his cure was the gold standard for treating the nervous exhaustion and hysteria of wealthy women.
Mitchell's fundamental philosophy was deeply rooted in the concept of energy conservation.
He believed that the female nervous system was inherently fragile, possessing a finite amount of nervous energy.
Any exertion beyond the simple domestic duties, especially intellectual labor, reading novels, or engaging in intense personal emotion, was a reckless drain on this vital reserve. Hysteria, in his view, was simply a body that had gone bankrupt, overdrawn its nervous account.
The cure, therefore, was not rest in the modern sense of a relaxing vacation, but a total, absolute physiological lockdown.
Imagine being ushered into a room where the laws of your life are instantly suspended. Total isolation was the rule. No visitors, except the physician and the nurse.
No letters from home. No music.
The window might be curtained to exclude the stimulating light of the sun. The sensory world was muted to a near complete stillness.
The second law was absolute immobility.
The patient was confined to bed, lying flat on her back, day and night. She was not allowed to sit up, turn over without assistance, or use her own muscles to leave the bed for any purpose. If she needed to be moved, the nurse performed the movement. This was meant to stop the entire motor system from wasting a single calorie of nervous energy.
The third law was forced ingestion.
The patient was subjected to a continuous regimen of high-fat, heavy foods, often large quantities of milk and cream, sometimes administered through forced feeding. The goal was rapid weight gain, intended to build up what Mitchell called the red blood and tissue, replacing the supposedly thin, exhausted nervous fluid. Picture the slow, viscous ingestion of cream, spoon-fed by a nurse. The patient's body, immobile and passive, becomes bloated and heavy. The silence of the room is punctuated only by the clock ticking and the sound of the nurse preparing the next meal. This enforced weight gain was meant to literally anchor the woman to the passive role, physically contradicting the idea of the wandering room or the flighty, cerebral nature of the hysteric. In the midst of this controlled stillness, the patient's mind, deprived of external stimulation, turned inward.
And this is precisely where the cure failed and where the rebellion began. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Quiet Rebellion. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was a writer, speaker, and intellectual fiercely dedicated to women's economic independence.
She was the antithesis of Mitchell's ideal patient.
When she fell into a nervous breakdown following childbirth, she was sent directly to Dr. Mitchell in 1887. Her time in his care was a psychological torture, which she later described in stark, unforgettable terms.
She realized, with terrifying clarity, that the suppression of her intellectual life was not curing her, but actively driving her toward genuine madness.
Imagine her internal monologue, the only motion left to her, racing against the stillness of the room.
Every instinct to write, to read, to think was a forbidden surge of hysterical energy.
To obey the doctor was to accept that her mind was a disease. To disobey was to risk being deemed incurably insane. When Mitchell discharged her, his final words of prescription were the most distractive. Live as domestic a life as possible. Have but 2 hours intellectual life a day.
And never touch pen, brush, or pencil again. For Gilman, the message was clear. Creativity was fatal.
Obedience was life.
But Gilman chose life. She fled her marriage, moved west, and began writing furiously.
Her short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, published in 1892, was her act of revenge, a brilliant, quiet psychological expose that remains the definitive account of the rescuer's cruelty.
The visual prison. Deconstructing the wallpaper, the central figure in Gilman's quiet rebellion is the yellow wallpaper itself. Imagine the color, not gold or bright yellow, but a sickly, sulfur color, a foul and perplexing shade that seems to absorb the light.
It is described as having sprawling, flamboyant patterns that defy all logic, running into each other, creating lame and meaningless curves.
This is the very essence of the bizarre cure, an object designed to be an external irritant for an internal problem, a distraction that is impossible to look away from.
Picture the narrator lying immobile, with nothing to do but stare at this monstrosity. The pattern becomes her obsession. The paper is already ripped and scratched from previous patients.
It stains the skin. It possesses a peculiar odor, a deep, haunting smell that the narrator cannot name, but that pervades her clothes and her hair.
It is the smell of repression, of confinement, of stagnant air and decaying thought. As her mind starves, she begins to project her own desperate need for movement and identity onto the paper.
She sees a figure behind the pattern, a woman stooping down and creeping. The structural design of the paper becomes the bars of a cage, and the woman trapped within is herself, the woman who wants to write, to speak, to escape. The process is slow, silent, and horrifying.
The patient's struggle is internal, masked by the quiet compliance imposed by the rescuer.
The only action is the narrator's increasing desire to free the trapped woman. The climax of the story is her final, manic act of peeling the paper entirely off the wall, physically tearing down the symbol of her imprisonment.
By the time her husband enters, the narrator is creeping over his prostrate body, completely identifying with the trapped woman. She has been cured of her hysteria by becoming completely mad, proving that the cure's demand for intellectual silence led to the ultimate mental destruction.
Gilman wrote the story not as fiction, but as a warning.
She stated her intention was to save people from being driven mad by the treatment. Her quiet, narrative act of defiance eventually contributed more to the end of the rescue than all the medical journals combined. The tragedy of the rescue is that it took the complex, valid anxiety of intelligent women, an anxiety born of social constraint, and treated it with a systematic, medically sanctioned assault on the self.
It failed because the bizarre cure attempted to deny the very human impulse to think, to create, and to be free. As we conclude this profound case study, let the heavy scent of that old room fade away.
The wallpaper is gone.
The bars are broken.
You are free to move and think without restriction.
Let the silence now be a comfort, not a command. Let us focus now on a bizarre cure that was perhaps the most misunderstood and quietly embarrassing practice in the entire history of hysteria, the therapeutic pelvic massage. This practice was rooted in the ancient theory of bringing the hysterical humors to a climax or resolution.
By the 19th century, this vague concept was applied directly to the female reproductive organs.
Doctors theorized that the congestion and tension in the pelvic region were the physical manifestation of the woman's nervous energy being blocked or stagnant. The prescribed cure was to manually stimulate the external genitalia until a hysterical paroxysm was achieved. Imagine the setting: a dimly lit, quiet doctor's office in the late 19th century. The patient, a woman of means, likely diagnosed with neurasthenia or chronic fatigue, has been deemed too nervous or too emotionally volatile. The doctor, a man of science and solemn demeanor, performs the procedure, which he views as a purely medical necessity to flush out the toxic vapors. The process, however, was excruciatingly tedious and time-consuming for the physician. Picture the sheer boredom and physical fatigue of the doctor. A single therapeutic session could last for hours, and the patient might require treatment multiple times a week.
The physician's hand would grow tired, cramped, and weary from the repetitive, manual labor required to induce the paroxysm.
For all the scientific airs the procedure took on, it was physically exhausting and economically inefficient for the medical professional. This quiet, chronic problem of the physician as fatigue, not the patient as cure, is the direct catalyst for one of the greatest and most fascinating innovations in the history of bizarre cures. The age of electrification and mechanical relief, the late 19th century, was the dawn of electrification and the harnessing of mechanical power. Doctors, tired of the repetitive strain, sought mechanical solutions to speed up the process. This is where the first iterations of the electric vibrator quietly entered the medical marketplace. The goal was purely utilitarian, to replace the physician's exhausted hand with a tireless machine.
The early devices were massive, steam-powered or battery-operated contraptions that looked more like industrial tools than medical instruments.
They were often referred to in medical texts as massage appliances or percussion devices. Imagine the sound and feel of these early machines. The air in the clinic would be filled with the rhythmic, mechanical whirring and clanking of the motor. The device, attached to a large rubberized wand, would deliver a powerful mechanical vibration, drastically reducing the time required to bring the patient to a paroxysm from hours to mere minutes. The medical journals of the time discussed these devices with clinical detachment, focusing on their efficiency and the energy they saved the physician. The success of the procedure was measured not by the patient's well-being, but by the speed at which the stagnant energy was released.
The invention and adoption of the mechanical device, therefore, was less about patient care and more about professional and economic efficiency for the doctor.
The cure goes home. The consumer shift. The next major shift occurred with the spread of domestic electricity and the miniaturization of motors. As homes were wired for power in the early 1900s, the large clinic-bound machines could be shrunk down to handheld, portable devices. This meant the therapeutic appliance could leave the doctor's office and enter the woman's home. The home vibrator was marketed not with any suggestion of pleasure, but as a multi-purpose, domestic health aid.
Imagine opening a glossy mail order catalog, like Sears Roebuck.
The device is advertised alongside electric fans, toasters, and sewing machines. The copy is serious and health-focused, promising relief from a host of female complaints, neuralgia and headaches, by stimulating the neck and temples, constipation and indigestion, by massaging the abdomen, nervousness and fatigue, by gently stimulating the nervous system. The vibrator was presented as an entirely medical, non-sexual cure for the omnipresent ailment of urasthenia.
It became a respectable, sanitary, modern way for a woman to manage her own chronic anxiety in the privacy of her boudoir, without the expensive, embarrassing, and time-consuming trip to the doctor for a therapeutic massage. The shift was profound.
For the first time, a woman could obtain the cure herself, in silence, without male intervention. The doctor had effectively automated himself out of a tedious and uncomfortable aspect of his practice, and in doing so, he unintentionally gave the patient a degree of private autonomy she had never possessed. The tragic irony, the entire saga of pelvic massage and the vibrator is laced with a deep, tragic irony.
For centuries, women's emotional and physical distress was dismissed as a moral or nervous failure, a refusal to be quiet and compliant.
The medical intervention to cure this was, fundamentally, the induction of a medically sanctioned orgasm, a release that the medical literature could not even name.
The bizarre cure for female repression and constraint was a physical relief that was so tedious to administer that it was mechanized and sent home.
The physician solved his ergonomic problem, and the patient was left alone with the cure, allowing the entire humiliating process to move into the shadows of domestic life.
The invention of the home vibrator is therefore a quiet monument to both medical arrogance and mechanical ingenuity.
It is a historical testament to how the bizarre cure for hysteria often revealed more about the anxieties and boredom of the doctor than it did about the suffering of the patient. As we conclude this deeply detailed segment, let the bizarre mechanical noise of the past recede.
You are in a place of quiet, simple rest, far from the clinical gaze. The long history of these strange cures has ended, and only peace remains.
Here is video segment 13, moving our quiet exploration from the clinical setting to the vast, influential world of culture, where the image of the hysteric was solidified for centuries.
The madwoman in the attic, hysteria in art and literature. Let us now turn our focus toward the power of imagination and the pervasive influence of the medical world on creative expression.
For 2,000 years,
The diagnosis of hysteria didn't just exist in doctors' offices. It was a potent creative motif that shaped art, literature, and film, teaching society exactly how a difficult woman was supposed to look.
The cultural image of the hysteric was created through a quiet, steady stream of artistic representation, serving as a constant visual and narrative reminder that a woman's emotional life was inherently unstable. The icon of the fainting fit, the most enduring visual icon of female anxiety throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, was the fainting fit.
Imagine the scene depicted in countless romantic and Victorian paintings. A woman, often wearing layers of constricting white lace, suddenly goes limp, supported dramatically in the arms of a gentleman or a maid.
Her head is tilted back, her eyes are closed, and her hand dangles limply. This was not just artistic license, it was a societal performance.
Fainting became the culturally acceptable way for a well-bred woman to express emotion, shock, or protest.
It was an involuntary, quiet expression of her delicacy and her profound sensitivity. She was overcome by her own vapors, a victim of her own biological frailty. Picture the visual symbolism. The fainting woman is passive, horizontal, and silent.
She is the opposite of the active, speaking, demanding woman.
This image reinforced the idea that female delicacy was a virtue, and that any strong, vertical ambition risked a collapse.
The bizarre cure for female ambition was literally to be rendered unconscious and reliant on male strength.
The literary asylum, the madwoman trope.
In Victorian literature, the hysteric evolved into a far more complex and terrifying figure. The madwoman in the attic, a symbol of female rage and intellectual repression.
Think of the dark, powerful figure of Bertha Mason in Charlotte Brant's Jane Eyre. Bertha is the secret, confined, mad wife of Mr. Rochester. She is violent, unpredictable, and kept locked away in the attic.
She is the embodiment of the suppressed passion, rage, and nonconformity that Jane Eyre, the heroine, must avoid to remain socially acceptable.
The literary function of this madwoman was to absorb all the negative emotions that the protagonist could not express.
Bertha was hysterical rage made physical, a woman whose sanity was destroyed by a loveless marriage and social confinement.
By locking her away, society could pretend that this kind of dangerous female passion was an isolated, pathological case, rather than a natural reaction to oppression. Another common literary manifestation was the anxious invalid, the passive, often beautiful woman who suffers quietly from an unnamed nervous affliction. Writers like Henry James and Edith Wharton used this character to explore the stifling nature of high society.
The invalid's condition was her only voice, her only subtle tool of protest against the expectations of domesticity.
She used her illness, her hysteria,
to command attention, to avoid social duty, and to subtly manipulate the quiet power structure of the home.
The literary world, therefore, normalized the link between female confinement and mental instability. The message was clear: if a woman's reality conflicted with her ambition, she would inevitably become either the fainting angel or the raving beast.
The theatricality of the body, from stage to screen, the influence of Dr. Charcot's dramatic stage presentations at the Salptr carried directly into the world of performance.
The dramatic fit, the arched back, the sudden collapse all became part of the actress's toolkit for portraying madness or emotional turmoil.
Imagine the flickering light of the early cinema projector. Early film, with its reliance on extreme physical gesture over dialogue, found perfect shorthand in the poses of the hysteric.
The woman in the silent film, clutching her throat, fainting in terror, or writhing in a convulsive fit, was instantly recognizable to the audience as a woman beyond rational control. The visual language of the hysteric, codified by medicine, became the theatrical language of emotion for an entire generation.
It taught women how to signal distress in public and taught men how to interpret and dismiss it.
The tragic hysteric, Camille Claudel. The cultural obsession with pathologizing female emotion found its most tragic real-life victim in the realm of art. The brilliant French sculptor Camille Claudel 1864194-3.
Claudel was a prodigious talent, a fierce creative spirit, and the student and lover of the great sculptor Auguste Rodin. Her work was intense, passionate, and often heartbreakingly expressive. Yet, her ambition, her tumultuous personal life, and her defiant refusal to conform to the role of a quiet domestic woman were interpreted as signs of mental breakdown.
Imagine the chaos of her studio, the clay, the dust, the intense focus, a creative energy that refused to be contained. After her relationship with Rodin ended and her family failed to support her career, she began to experience severe emotional turmoil and paranoia.
Instead of seeing a brilliant mind in distress and providing support, her family and her doctors defaulted to the familiar script. Her passion was deemed excessive.
Her genius was re-diagnosed as mania.
In 1913, she was forcibly committed to an asylum. Her diagnosis, a paranoid form of hysteria.
Picture the silent, white walls of the asylum.
Her family ensured she remained locked away for the next 30 years, despite doctors suggesting she was stable enough to leave.
The artistic community quietly protested, but the medical authority, backed by a family's desire to erase scandal, prevailed.
The final bizarre cure for female genius was perpetual confinement and enforced silence. Clodagh case serves as a heartbreaking epitaph for the entire history of hysteria.
Her intense creative energy, which should have been her salvation, was instead used as the proof of her illness. The medical gaze, seeking to classify and control, saw not a sculptor, but a defective female mind. As we conclude this segment, let the quiet weight of this injustice settle upon you.
The final, powerful lesson of the hysteric in culture is that we must always strive to see genius and ambition, where others historically saw only pathology.
The quiet is yours now, unjudged and free. We are now imagining a large, imposing structure built of heavy stone or dark brick, sitting isolated on the outskirts of a major city.
These were fortresses of confinement, designed not just to house the mentally ill, but to remove them entirely from the sight and consciousness of polite society.
The architecture itself was a bizarre cure, built on the principle that the patient needed to be completely severed from the pressures of the world. Picture the entrance: high, unforgiving walls, massive gates that clang shut, and windows that are small, high, and often barred.
There is an immediate, palpable sense of permanence. Once inside, you are subject to the absolute, unwavering authority of the institution.
The sounds and silence of confinement, the overwhelming sensory experience of the asylum, was the enforced quiet. This silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, and constantly punctuated by the institutional sounds of control.
Imagine the floors, often polished wood or cold tile that echoes every footstep.
The constant clanging of keys against the hip of the attendant is the true heartbeat of the asylum, a reminder that freedom is held captive by a small piece of metal.
There is the repeated, heavy thud of thick doors being locked and unlocked.
The silence might be abruptly broken by a sudden, terrifying scream or a bout of uncontrollable weeping from a distant ward, the sound of an utterly broken mind.
But these outbursts were quickly quelled, often by heavy-handed physical intervention or chemical sedation, restoring the pervasive, unnatural quiet.
The air itself carries a specific smell, a mixture of strong, acrid disinfectant carbolic acid, used to mask other odors, stale, unmoving air, and the bland, boiled scent of institutional food. This is the smell of being utterly separated from the living, fresh world. The monotony of the cure for the woman diagnosed with hysteria. Daily life in the asylum was the rest cure expanded to a monumental scale. It was a life defined by monotonous, mandatory routine, designed to crush any spark of individuality or spontaneous thought. Imagine the schedule: up at the same hour, dressed in the same uniform, often coarse cotton or woolen institutional gowns, forced to eat the same planned food in communal silence. There was no reading, no writing, and very little purposeful activity.
Patients were often forced to engage in endless, repetitive tasks, like sewing or knitting, or simply mandated to sit motionless on benches lining the walls of a day room.
The ultimate bizarre cure here was boredom. It was a life designed to be so utterly featureless that the overstimulated, nervous mind would eventually retreat into utter passivity. The institution aimed to strip away the complex, demanding woman and replace her with a compliant, silent resident. Institutionalized hydrotherapy and restraint.
Within the asylum, the physical treatments that were once performed in a quiet clinic took on a punitive, controlling edge.
The practice of hydrotherapy was ubiquitous. While it could be delivered gently, it was often used as a means of punishment or immediate behavioral control. Imagine the cold water douche. The patient is stripped, held fast, and subjected to a high-pressure jet of ice-cold water aimed at her spine or head. The shock was meant to reset the nervous system, but it was often administered in response to an emotional outburst, functioning as a brutal physical deterrent against further hysterical behavior.
For patients deemed unmanageable or dangerously agitated, mechanical restraints were the last resort. The sight of a woman confined to a heavy canvas straitjacket or strapped to a bed with leather cuffs was the ultimate symbol of the medical failure to understand her pain. The rationale was control.
The reality was physical and psychological terror.
The bizarre cure for emotional volatility was total physical immobility. The quiet tragedy of erasure, the deepest tragedy of the asylum experience for the hysteric, was the erasure of identity. When a woman was committed, she was removed from her role as wife, daughter, or mother.
Her personal effects were taken away.
She was often referred to only by her surname or her room number.
Her individuality was dissolved into the collective, silent suffering of the ward.
The asylum was the physical embodiment of the medical system's final judgment. Your complex pain cannot be understood, so you must be removed. Your voice is disruptive, so you must be silenced.
The immense, cold structures of the Victorian asylum stand today as quiet, enduring monuments to the damage caused by the generalized, gender diagnosis of hysteria. They remind us that the most painful cure is often the simple, profound act of being made invisible and silent by the very world that claims to be healing you. Let this reflection guide you now.
You are safe from those old walls and the cold, heavy silence of institutional confinement. The quiet of your own space is one of safety and freedom.
Rest in the knowledge of the past.
Pivoting now to examine the profound nervous conditions that afflicted the male population during the same period, confirming that the anxiety crisis of the 19th century was universal, but the judgment applied to it was strictly gendered. As we discussed the Victorian woman and her diagnosis of hysteria, we must recognize her quiet, nervous counterpart, the neurasthenic man. The American nervousness.
The diagnosis of neurasthenia, literally meaning nervous weakness or exhaustion of the nerves, was coined and popularized by the American neurologist George Miller Beard in 1869. Beard argued that this was the definitive modern American disease, a direct byproduct of the intense pace of industrial and technological progress. Imagine the sudden, jarring noise of the late 19th century city, the constant din of machinery, the frantic pace of the stock exchange, the endless demands of the telegraph and the railroad. Beard theorized that these forces were literally draining the electrical energy from the human nervous system, like a battery left constantly plugged in. The symptoms of male neurasthenia were real and debilitating: chronic fatigue, severe anxiety, persistent insomnia, mysterious body aches, and a debilitating fear of crowds, agoraphobia. The neurasthenic man was exhausted, often too anxious to work, and deeply worried about his intellectual and sexual performance. The crucial difference between this and female hysteria lay entirely in the attribution of cause. For the man, neurasthenia was a badge of honor, a sign that he had worked too hard, thought too intensely, and pushed his intellect to the breaking point.
It was a noble illness, the disease of civilization and genius.
His suffering was proof of his ambition and his dedication to the industrial machine. For the woman, a similar set of symptoms was blamed on a faulty uterus, emotional excess, or, ironically, attempting to engage in the very same intellectual and ambitious pursuits that had sickened the man. The male experience was deemed a consequence of a stressful environment. The female experience was deemed a consequence of a defective biology.
The opposite cure, restless motion, the treatments prescribed for the neurasthenic man, were the exact antithesis of Dr. Weir Mitchell's rest cure, a stark contrast that reveals the depths of the gender bias.
While the nervous woman was confined to a dark room, force-fed, and forbidden intellectual activity, the nervous man was prescribed the West cure. Picture a dusty, open landscape under a vast sky, perhaps the Rocky Mountains or the wide open plains. The neurasthenic man was told to leave the corrupting influence of the city and engage in robust, masculine activity.
He was encouraged to take up camping, hunting, horseback riding, and physical labor.
This cure was a celebration of motion, exertion, and confrontation with the natural world. It was a reaffirmation of his core masculinity, designed to prove that he was not weak or effeminate, but simply temporarily exhausted by his heroic endeavors. The therapy was not about silencing his mind, but about redirecting his energy into physical conquest. Even the most famous proponent of the rest cure, Dr. Weir Mitchell, recognized this duality and prescribed his male patients a journey to Europe or vigorous outdoor activity, rather than total immobility. He believed that forcing a man into complete passivity would damage his sense of self-worth, an idea he never extended to his female patients. This contrast is a quiet indictment of the medical system, The bizarre cure for the neurasthenic man validated his identity.
The bizarre cure for the hysterical woman sought to erase hers.
The nervous genius.
The cultural framing of male neurasthenia further solidified its honorable status.
The nervous, overly sensitive, but brilliant man became a staple of literature and popular culture.
Think of the enduring appeal of the hyper-intellectual, perpetually anxious character.
His use of stimulants, cocaine, opium, or excessive tobacco was often framed not as addiction, but as a necessary tool to manage the crushing boredom of a mind too great for its world. His nervousness was merely the side effect of genius. This image stands in direct contrast to the portrayal of the female hysteric, whose emotional intensity was seen as proof of her incapacity to reason.
For the man, his nervous tension was his creative fuel. For the woman, it was her fatal flaw.
The entire social framework of the 19th century created two diseases out of one universal problem: the stress of modern life.
It assigned the victimhood of the system to the man neurasthenia and the victimhood of the self to the woman hysteria. The quiet disappearance.
Neurasthenia, much like hysteria, eventually faded from the medical lexicon, but it did so quietly and without the stigma that clung to its female counterpart. As the 20th century progressed, the symptoms of neurasthenia were gradually absorbed into the broader, non-gendered categories of generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder. The diagnosis vanished largely because it served its cultural purpose. It validated the male struggle in a rapidly changing world.
Once that validation was no longer needed, once male symptoms could be safely labeled under a general category, the specific, romantic name of neurasthenia was retired without the controversy that surrounded the removal of hysteria. This comparative study provides the final, undeniable proof that the bizarre cures and the diagnoses that necessitated them were always social constructs.
They were not scientific fact, but carefully engineered systems for managing gender roles and societal expectations. The medicine was merely the vessel for the prejudice. Let this knowledge settle over you now. The arbitrary labels of the past hold no power here. All that remains is the profound, soothing quiet of deep, restful understanding. Focusing now on the slow, essential process by which the medical world finally learned to correctly identify the root cause of many hysterical and neurasthenic symptoms: psychological trauma. This pivot marks the true victory of modern understanding over ancient prejudice. The journey began not in the doctor's office, but in the chaos of industrial accidents, specifically those involving the new technology of the 19th century, the railroad. The shock of the railroad spine. In the mid-19th century, doctors began to observe a strange phenomenon following train crashes. People who had been involved in collisions, but suffered no obvious physical injury, no broken bones, no external wounds, would soon develop severe, debilitating symptoms. They would suffer from intense anxiety, chronic insomnia, crippling headaches, and often inexplicable paralysis or tremors. This was dubbed railroad spine or railway shock. Imagine the patient, a man or woman who survived the sudden, violent shock of the impact, the terrifying noise, the vibration, the immediate fear of death.
A few weeks later, they are exhibiting classic symptoms of either neurasthenia in a man or hysteria in a woman.
The symptoms were real, but the cause was invisible. Many physicians, clinging to the old ideas, dismissed the condition as pure malingering or the latest form of hysteria, particularly when the patient was seeking compensation from the powerful railroad companies. However, a growing minority of doctors began to argue that the violent shock of the accident, the overwhelming psychological and physical jolt, had somehow injured the nervous system, even without visible damage. This was the critical first step, linking a profound external event to a subsequent invisible nervous disease.
The bizarre cure applied was often a cynical one: denial of their suffering, followed by prolonged legal battles, which, of course, only exacerbated their anxiety.
But the phenomenon itself created a crack in the old diagnostic framework, suggesting that the problem lay in the experience, not the biology. Shell shock, the irrefutable proof. The crack widened into a chasm during World War I, with the emergence of shell shock.
We touched on this previously, but the scale and depth of this particular trauma proved to be the final, irreversible nail in the coffin of gendered nervous diagnoses.
The sheer volume of men, hundreds of thousands of soldiers returning from the trenches with classic hysterical symptoms, was too massive to ignore and too humiliating to attribute to female weakness. Picture the environment of the trenches. It was a world of non-stop, deafening noise. The constant concussion of artillery shells created a deep, physical vibration that shook the entire body and the mind day after day. A soldier might develop mutism, becoming unable to speak.
He might suffer from severe facial tics, uncontrollable full-body tremors, or paralysis in his limbs.
These were the exact symptoms previously categorized as hysterical conversion disorder in women. The initial medical response was to punish and shame the men, viewing them as cowards or malingerers who were refusing to fight. They were often subjected to electric shock therapy, a brutal, targeted, bizarre cure intended to literally shock them out of their supposed moral failing. However, the sheer reality of the trauma was undeniable.
These were not moral failures, but nervous systems that had been shattered by overwhelming, prolonged, and life-threatening terror.
The medical community was forced to concede that the same physical and psychological conversion symptoms that afflicted the hysteric could, and did, afflict any human being pushed beyond the limits of endurance. The experience of shell shock essentially degendered the concept of psychological conversion. The problem was not a wandering womb. The problem was the overwhelming, catastrophic stressor. The new language of suffering, PTSD, the final, definitive step in this long journey, occurred after the Vietnam War. The experience of soldiers returning home with severe, complex psychological symptoms, flashbacks, nightmares, emotional numbness, and hypervigilance led to an intensive effort to create a diagnosis that honored the role of the external event. This effort culminated in the 1980 publication of the DSM-3, where, as we noted, the diagnosis of hysterical neurosis was finally removed. In that same volume, a new revolutionary diagnostic category was introduced: post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The creation of PTSD marked the complete triumph of the trauma-informed perspective. The diagnosis established that a person could experience a specific, identifiable, and overwhelming traumatic event and subsequently develop a predictable, chronic set of symptoms. It was a diagnosis based on the event, not the gender or the supposed moral character of the person. This shift in focus from "what is wrong with you" to "what happened to you"
is the most profound and ethical reversal of the past 2 millennia of medical practice.
The cure of listening. The ultimate, quiet lesson of this final transition is that the bizarre cure for hysteria was simply the courage to listen to the patient's story. The historical journey from the wandering womb to the diagnosis of PTSD demonstrates how long it took the medical world to trust the patient's reality. The woman who came to the doctor complaining of paralysis was not failing to manage her emotions. She was trying to tell a truth her body could not otherwise express. "I am trapped," or "I cannot move forward."
The bizarre cures, the water shock, the forced rest, the surgical cut were all attempts to intervene physically when the problem was fundamentally experiential.
The simple, true cure was to acknowledge the terror, the loss, or the chronic stress that shattered the nervous system.
Let this knowledge settle gently upon you now.
The shadows of those historical shocks, the clatter of the train, the noise of the shell, the fear of the attic, are all absorbed into the understanding that your nervous system is a mirror of your world.
You are safe here, in the present, free from the old misdiagnoses. All that remains is the deep, peaceful quiet of rest. Having established that hysteria was a physical manifestation of psychological distress, the next logical step for medicine was to abandon the bizarre physical cures and find a way to access and treat the invisible wound.
This took place in the quiet, hushed atmosphere of a Viennese parlor.
The quiet genesis, and chimney sweeping.
The foundation of modern talk therapy lies in the crucial case study of a woman known historically as Anna O, whose real name was Bertha Pappenheim. Her physician, Joseph Breuer, and his younger colleague, Sigmund Freud, studied her case intently in the 1880s. Anna O presented with classic, severe hysterical symptoms. She suffered from paralysis in her limbs, severe disturbances in her vision and speech, at one point being unable to speak her native German, only English or French, and deep anxiety.
All physical exams failed to find a cause for her profound suffering.
Imagine the atmosphere of the room. Instead of prescribing a painful physical procedure or isolation, Breuer simply encouraged her to speak freely about her feelings and memories while under a light hypnotic state. He observed that when she verbalized the traumatic memories connected to the onset of her symptoms, particularly her repressed grief over nursing her dying father, the corresponding physical symptoms would temporarily diminish or disappear entirely. Anna O
herself, with profound clarity, named this process chimney sweeping, because it felt like clearing the accumulated dust and smoke of repressed emotions out of her mind. Breuer and Freud named it catharsis, the emotional purging of psychic tension.
This was the quiet, revolutionary moment in the history of medicine. The ultimate bizarre cure for paralysis, mutism, and convulsive fits was simply language. The doctor's role shifted from manipulating the body with machines to listening to the stories of the mind with patients.
The Freudian unconscious and conversion.
Freud took Breuer's findings and built the monumental structure of psychoanalysis.
He established the core concept that the symptoms of hysteria, which he often referred to as conversion neuroses, were a direct result of repression.
Picture the unconscious mind as a deep, vast cavern beneath the surface of awareness. Traumatic experiences and socially unacceptable desires, thoughts too painful or dangerous for the conscious mind to bear, are forcibly locked away, repressed. But this psychic energy does not simply vanish.
It finds a way to escape, like water seeking the path of least resistance.
The mind converts the emotional energy into a physical symptom. The overwhelming desire to flee is converted into paralysis. The unbearable memory of something seen is converted into functional blindness. The paralysis becomes a symbolic language spoken by the body for the mind that cannot utter the words.
The psychoanalytic cure, therefore, became a quiet, intense process of excavation.
The patient would lie on the famous couch, often facing away from the analyst, and engage in free association, speaking every thought that came to mind, no matter how trivial or embarrassing. The analyst's job was to listen for the subtle clues, the slips of the tongue, the recurring symbols in the patient's language that pointed back to the original repressed trauma. The therapy was long, slow, and expensive, often taking years. Imagine the slow, quiet atmosphere of that office, the rhythmic ticking of a clock, the faint scent of cigars, the heavy velvet drapes muffling the sounds of Vienna.
It was a space dedicated entirely to the exploration of the inner world, a radical departure from the noisy, invasive, physical treatments of the past.
The quiet intellectual chaos. The birth of psychoanalysis, however, was not a singular, unified event.
As the 20th century turned, Freud's absolute authority led to sharp intellectual schisms, creating a diversification of talking cures, a quiet chaos in the search for the best approach.
Carl Jung, one of Freud's most brilliant students, broke away to focus not on personal childhood trauma, but on the collective unconscious, the idea that we all share universal symbols and archetypes that shape our internal lives.
His quiet, analytical approach sought to integrate the personal story with the mythology and spirituality of human history.
Alfred Adler, another influential figure, rejected Freud's focus on sexuality and instead emphasized the individual's drive for superiority and the impact of social context. He argued that hysteria and neuroses were often rooted in deep feelings of inferiority, and the bizarre cure lay in strengthening the patient's sense of community and personal agency. Each of these thinkers offered a distinct variation of the talking cure, but all shared the core belief: the problem lay in the mind and the social environment, and the key to healing was a relationship built on trust, language, and quiet, sustained listening.
The counter-cure, behaviorism. Yet, even as the talking cures flourished, a powerful counter-movement emerged, which briefly threatened to pull psychology back toward a more mechanical, less humane approach: behaviorism.
Figures like Ivan Pavlov, BFF, Skinner, and John B.N.
Watson argued that the entire concept of the unconscious was mystical and unscientific.
They claimed that hysteria and neuroses were merely a set of learned behaviors, maladaptive responses to environmental stimuli that had been reinforced over time. For the behaviorist, the bizarre cure was not quiet analysis, but unlearning the behavior through strict conditioning. This led to techniques like aversion therapy, punishment for the behavior, and systematic desensitization, gradually exposing the patient to the feared stimulus. While behaviorism led to effective treatments for specific phobias, its complete dismissal of internal experience, memory, and trauma, the very things that caused the historical suffering, marked a brief, cold turn away from the compassion inherent in the talking cure. Ultimately, the talking cure survived and flourished because it acknowledged the fundamental truth that the centuries of hysteria had proven: a person in distress needs to be heard, not electrocuted, starved, or silenced. The non-judgmental quiet of the therapeutic room became the final, true setting for the dismantling of the invisible disease. Let this knowledge bring you a profound sense of rest.
The quiet now is a comfort, an invitation to stillness, and a promise of acceptance. Examining the enormous, invisible forces that created the nervous conditions of the 19th century, We are leaving the individual patient and the doctor's office to view the world through a sociological lens, understanding that the epidemic of hysteria and neurasthenia was not a biological failure, but a direct consequence of rapid industrial change.
The assault of speed and time. The 19th century witnessed a fundamental change in the human relationship to time and distance.
This change was rapid, stressful, and overwhelming to the nervous system, which had evolved over millennia in a slow agrarian context.
Imagine the sudden tyranny of the industrial clock.
For most of human history, time was fluid, dictated by the sun and the seasons.
The factory system and the railroad enforced a rigid minute-by-minute schedule. This new discipline created constant internal stress, as the body and mind struggled to maintain an unnatural, relentless pace. The bizarre cure for nervous exhaustion was, ironically, the enforced rest of the asylum, an attempt to physically pull the patient back to a pre-industrial, fluid pace of life. Even more impactful was the telegraph.
Suddenly, news, commerce, and human tragedy were communicated instantaneously across vast distances.
Prior to the telegraph, news traveled at the speed of the fastest horse or ship. After its invention, a disaster on the other side of the country could generate instant, remote anxiety. This instantaneous shock was a profound burden on the nervous system, generating a persistent, low-grade hypervigilance that had never existed before.
The invention of the telegraph literally destroyed the concept of local time, forcing entire continents to align to a single schedule, shattering the quiet, isolated realities of small communities. The human nervous system, built for local concerns, was suddenly overwhelmed by the anxieties of a global network.
The erosion of boundaries. The railroad contributed its own specific form of nervous exhaustion. It not only caused physical railway shock, but also generated a terrifying sense of perpetual motion and boundary erosion.
Picture the noise, the vibration, and the speed of the train rushing through the landscape.
For the first time, people were subjected to prolonged, intense sensory stimulation that was entirely artificial. The constant vibration was thought by many doctors to directly injure the nerves, causing tremors and fatigue. More subtly, the railroad destroyed the clear boundaries between home and the world.
Travel became common, displacing people from their stable, known environments. This perpetual sense of uprootedness and motion contributed directly to the anxiety, insomnia, and the profound feeling of being unmoored that characterized both hysteria and neurasthenia.
The nervous system was simply not built for continuous, high-speed travel and constant sensory noise.
The quiet of the rural past was gone, replaced by the relentless, grinding din of the modern machine.
The double bind of social roles. These industrial forces magnified the existing rigid social pressures on both men and women, leading to the two distinct, gendered nervous crises.
For the neurasthenic man, the nervous exhaustion was a result of the cult of ambition.
The new American ideal of laissez-faire capitalism demanded ruthless competition, relentless work, and the constant risk of financial ruin. Success was celebrated, but failure was total, leading to a profound, constant fear. The man's symptoms: insomnia, anxiety, exhaustion were the physiological breakdown caused by the absolute terror of losing his position in the brutal economic hierarchy.
His bizarre cure, the West cure, was society's attempt to restore his strength, so he could return to the competitive fight.
For the hysterical woman of the middle and upper classes, the nervous exhaustion was caused by the opposite force, energy stagnation. She was trapped in the cult of true womanhood, confined to the quiet, restrictive domestic sphere.
Her enormous intellectual and emotional energy, inherited perhaps from the same ambitious drive that exhausted her husband, had no acceptable outlet.
She was discouraged from reading, forbidden professional ambition, and expected to dedicate her entire life to the performance of passive, domestic virtue. The energy that the man burned in the stock exchange was the same energy the woman was forced to repress in the parlor.
Her body found an outlet for that repressed, stagnant energy through conversion symptoms. The paralysis allowed her to escape her duties. The fainting allowed her a momentary release from her performance.
The social safety valve. Ultimately, the twin diagnoses of hysteria and neurasthenia functioned as social safety valves for a society under immense strain. By labeling the nervous man neurasthenic, society gave him a temporary, honorable exit from the competitive grind. He could rest, travel, and recover his nervous energy without being permanently stigmatized as a failure. By labeling the nervous woman hysterical, society provided a non-verbal language for protest. The woman could express her anger, her boredom, and her profound dissatisfaction with her domestic prison through her body convulsions, paralysis, and fits without ever having to utter a single dangerous, rebellious word.
The bizarre cure was an attempt to close that valve.
The doctors of the era were not curing the patients. They were attempting to manage the social chaos created by a world accelerating beyond human capacity.
They diagnosed the individual failure, rather than the profound failure of the industrial system itself.
Let this reflection settle deep within you. The quiet tragedy of the past is a reminder that we must always look beyond the individual symptom to the wider world that created the suffering.
You are here now, in a place of quiet, a slow contemplation, far removed from the frantic pace of that nervous century.
Rest in the stillness.
Moving now to examine the powerful, often mysterious, methods that bypassed the body entirely and attempted to cure hysteria purely through the power of the mind. Mesmerism and hypnotism. These practices were the bizarre cures that relied on suggestion, providing a crucial,
quiet bridge between the physical cruelty of the past and the analytical patience of the future, Franz Mesmer, and the flow of magnetism. The story begins in the 18th century with a flamboyant and controversial Austrian physician named Franz Anton Mesmer. Mesmer believed he had discovered the key to human health and illness: animal magnetism. Imagine the era. A time when science was obsessed with invisible forces like gravity and electricity.
Mesmer theorized that an invisible, subtle magnetic fluid flowed throughout the universe and, crucially, through the bodies of all living beings.
Illness, including the vast array of hysterical symptoms, was caused by a blockage or imbalance in the flow of this magnetic fluid.
The bizarre cure was designed to restore this flow through ritual. Picture his sessions in Paris, which became an obsession of the French elite.
The atmosphere was deliberately theatrical: dim lighting, soft, often dramatic music, and heavy velvet drapes.
The patients, usually a mix of nervous men and hysterical women, would gather around a large circular oak tub called the bouquet.
This bouquet was filled with chemical compounds, iron filings, and water, with iron rods protruding outward. Patients would grasp these rods or connect themselves with ropes, forming a collective circle.
Mesmer, often dressed in lavish robes, would walk slowly among them, touching patients with his hands or an iron wand, attempting to guide the magnetic fluid.
The goal was to induce a crisis, a profound, intense, often convulsive fit, weeping, or uncontrollable laughter. Mesmer believed this spectacular fit was the moment the blockage was broken and the magnetic fluid was restored. The hysterical symptom was not merely being addressed, it was being amplified and controlled for a supposed therapeutic benefit. Mesmerism was highly effective because it relied entirely on suggestion, collective emotion, and theatrical ritual. The mind, convinced it was being healed by a mysterious cosmic force, would manifest a physical response. From magnetism to psychology, official French scientific bodies eventually investigated Mesmer and declared his animal magnetism theory to be a fraud, concluding that any effects observed were due to the patient's imagination, the power of suggestion. This dismissal, while accurate about the magnetic fluid, inadvertently confirmed the true power of the technique, the mind's ability to create and resolve physical symptoms based on belief. Later practitioners stripped away the bizarre magnetic theories, focusing purely on the induced psychological state. In the mid-19th century, the Scottish physician James Braid coined the term hypnotism from the Greek word hypnos, meaning sleep. Braid insisted that the phenomenon was not about fluid transfer, but about the intense, focused state of the patient's attention and concentration, a trance-like state that allowed suggestion to bypass critical judgment. This shift brought the practice into a quiet, more respectable medical light. Hypnotism was no longer a stage show. It was a psychological tool. Charcot, hypnotism, and the hysteric. This newly respectable practice of hypnotism was central to the work of Jean-Martin Charcot at the Salpêtrière. Charcot, the father of modern neurology, used hypnotism as his primary tool to investigate hysteria. He demonstrated that he could induce the entire range of hysterical symptoms: paralysis, tremors, amnesia in his patients through suggestion, and then, with a counter-suggestion, he could remove them. Imagine Charcot standing over a woman in a trance.
With a simple, quiet command, her arm stiffens into an unmoving cataleptic pose.
With another command, the paralysis vanishes. For Charcot, this was proof that hysteria was a genuine, though functional, neurological condition, a disease of the nervous system that was highly susceptible to suggestion.
But this reliance on his own quiet, powerful will over the patient's mind led to a deeply problematic dynamic.
The symptoms Charcot saw in his patients often reflected the very symptoms he was expecting, showing the profound influence of the medical authority on the patient's illness. Freud's quiet departure hypnotism played a direct foundational role in the beginning of Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic journey. Freud initially used hypnotism with Breuer and other patients suffering from hysteria, attempting to access the repressed memories that underlay their conversion symptoms. However, Freud soon became dissatisfied with the technique for two quiet but critical reasons. It didn't work on everyone. Some patients were simply not susceptible to the hypnotic trance. It didn't provide lasting insight. While symptoms would vanish under hypnosis, they often returned because the patient had not consciously processed the underlying conflict. Freud realized that true, lasting cure lay not in the doctor's commanding suggestion, but in the patient's own quiet, conscious voice.
He abandoned hypnotism, replaced the hypnotic couch with the famous analytical couch, and developed free association, the patient's active, conscious speaking of the unconscious.
The history of mesmerism and hypnotism is a quiet tragedy of power and suggestion. It was a bizarre cure that finally proved the mental, not physical origin of hysteria, but for a long time, it simply replaced the brute force of surgery with the subtle, compelling force of the doctor's will. The ultimate cure was the one that allowed the patient to find her own voice. Without the trance, let this knowledge settle over you now. The power of suggestion is everywhere, but the quiet strength of your own awareness is always the greater force. Rest now with clear thought. Focusing our attention now on a vulnerable and often silenced group, the child patient, and how the medical gaze of the 19th century extended the diagnosis of hysteria to include the nervous girl. The Victorian era held a particularly rigid, idealized view of childhood, especially for girls. They were to be innocent, quiet, obedient, and entirely subservient to the adult moral code. Any deviation from this narrow path, a burst of temper, excessive imagination, or uncontrollable nervousness was not seen as normal development, but as a dangerous precursor to adult hysteria. The medical system, therefore, sought to impose its bizarre cures early, aiming to stamp out the nervous tendency before it matured, the miniature diagnosis.
For young girls, hysteria became the medical language for a wide range of disruptive or defiant behaviors.
It was the catch-all for any symptom that challenged the tranquility of the Victorian home, pavor nocturnus, severe night terrors and sleepwalking, which were sometimes seen not as developmental stages or reactions to fear, but as evidence of a fundamentally unstable nervous system.
Functional mutism, a child who refused to speak, often after witnessing or experiencing a traumatic family event, was not seen as psychologically blocked, but as suffering from a physical conversion symptom. The tongue was paralyzed by hysteria.
School refusal and nervous headaches.
Girls who were anxious about schoolwork or struggled with the rigid intellectual demands were often afflicted by severe, unexplained headaches or stomach aches. These were often dismissed as hysterical attempts to avoid duty, resulting in the child being pulled from school and subjected to the beginning of the rest cure.
Imagine the small figure of the child in a doctor's study.
Her fear is interpreted as nervous volatility.
Her defiance is interpreted as a faulty developing will. The doctor, unable to find a physical cause for her stomach pain, simply concludes that the turbulence of her developing reproductive system or her uncontrolled emotions must be the culprit. The vast adult diagnosis of hysteria was shrunk down and applied to the small frame of a girl. Cures for the child's will.
The bizarre cures applied to children, while generally less invasive than surgery, were designed with the same central goal: to break the child's will and impose absolute emotional obedience.
The cure for the child was always moral control, dietary restriction and control. Food was frequently used as a tool of psychological punishment. A nervous child who threw a tantrum or exhibited excessive emotion might be placed on a severely bland, restrictive diet. The focus on control what went into the body was an attempt to control the emotions that came out.
Mild hydrotherapy, the use of cold baths or cold showers, sometimes called ablutions, was common.
These were prescribed not just for hygiene, but for nervous shock. The child was subjected to the acute, sudden physical shock of cold water, which was intended to suppress the nervous excitement and literally chill out the developing hysteria. It was a disciplinary tool disguised as a medical procedure. Isolation and moral instruction. The ultimate cure was often a mild, domestic version of the asylum. The child was isolated from her peers and bombarded with intense moral and religious instruction. She was taught that her nervousness was a sign of sin or a lack of spiritual fortitude, and that only through absolute obedience and quiet passivity could her nervous system be healed. The bizarre cure for trauma was guilt. This early pathologizing had devastating consequences.
It taught girls that their bodies were inherently unreliable, that their intellectual curiosity was dangerous, and that their emotional suffering was a sign of moral failing.
It perfectly prepared them for the adult diagnosis of hysteria, the silent language of trauma. As with adult hysteria, the modern understanding of the child patient has completely reversed the historical diagnosis. We now know that the child's hysterical symptoms were almost always a physical manifestation of profound, unexpressed distress. A child who develops a functional paralysis in the face of family conflict is not inventing the illness. She is converting the overwhelming feeling of being unable to escape or intervene into a physical inability to move. The child's brain, unable to process the trauma, uses the body to express the forbidden truth. The modern focus on adverse childhood experiences ACEs and the neurological impact of developmental trauma reveals that the unexplained symptoms of the child hysteric are often a direct physiological response to abuse, neglect, or chronic emotional upheaval within the family structure. The physical symptom was not a conscious attempt to avoid duty. It was the nervous system's desperate, automatic attempt at survival. The tragedy is that when the child sought help, the medical system, armed with a diagnosis of hysteria, failed to ask the only question that mattered: what is happening to you at home? Instead, the child was punished for their symptoms, magnifying the original trauma. Let this final image of the child patient settle over you now. The silence of the asylum and the stillness of the rest cure were doubly tragic when applied to a developing mind. The quiet we share now is a quiet born of understanding, an acceptance of the vulnerability of the human spirit.
Turning our attention now to the 20th century, where the bizarre quest to cure the mind through physical shock reached its most dramatic and controversial form. Electroconvulsive therapy (ECT), even as psychoanalysis flourished in the early 1900s. The belief that a profound physical jolt could reboot a broken mind persisted in the asylum.
The idea was simple. If the nervous system was overwhelmed, perhaps a temporary, massive shock could erase the error and force a return to normalcy. The era of shock therapy. The early 20th century saw several attempts to introduce controlled, physical shock to the body as a bizarre cure for severe mental illness. One of the most dangerous was insulin coma therapy, invented in the 1930s. Imagine the procedure. The patient, often suffering from severe schizophrenia or deep depression, was given massive doses of insulin, deliberately inducing a coma and a profound hypoglycemic seizure. This was a brutal and high-risk procedure, requiring constant medical monitoring and often leading to severe neurological damage or death. The psychological logic was that the near-death experience of the coma would somehow interrupt the psychotic process. Another method was the use of the drug metrazole, a powerful convulsant. This drug was injected to induce a violent, full-body seizure, often leading to bone fractures. These methods, the coma and the chemically induced seizure, set the stage for the search for a simpler, less messy form of shock, the invention of the electrical shock. The key moment came in the late 1930s in Italy, with the work of psychiatrists Ugo Saletti and Lucio Bini.
Their breakthrough came from a gruesome, yet strangely logical, observation at a slaughterhouse.
They noticed that before pigs were slaughtered, they were stunned with a brief application of electric current to their heads to render them unconscious and immobile. The current reliably induced a seizure. Saletti and Bini hypothesized that this controlled, electrically induced seizure might be a safer, cleaner replacement for the drug-induced convulsions of metrazole. The initial experiments with ECT were frighteningly crude and violent. Imagine the earliest shock room. The patient is given no anesthesia and no muscle relaxants.
2 electrodes are placed on the patient's temples.
The current, a powerful surge of electricity, is applied for a fraction of a second. The immediate result was terrifying: a violent, full-body grand mal seizure. The patient's back would arch into the classic arc-D circle of the hysterical fit, arms and legs flailing, often resulting in fractured vertebrae, dislocated jaws, and extreme physical exhaustion.
The whole event was accompanied by the quiet, terrifying sound of the machine whirring and the faint smell of burnt skin, where the electrodes were applied. The bizarre cure for the intractable neuroses, the modern term for the hysteric who resisted therapy, was immediate, overwhelming physical force. The tool of institutional control by the 1940s and 52nd, ECT became a ubiquitous, if controversial, tool within psychiatric institutions globally.
It was easy to administer, quick, and most importantly to the overworked staff. It was effective at achieving immediate institutional compliance. Picture the institutional use. ECT was often deployed not just for medical reasons, but as a form of punishment or threat for agitated or disruptive patients.
A hysteric who was loud, rebellious, or non-compliant could be quickly quieted by the threat of the shock room.
It became the ultimate gesture of medical authority, the final word in the argument between the doctor and the patient. The temporary amnesia and disorientation that followed the procedure often suppressed the patient's most recent memories and emotional intensity, making them temporarily docile. The patient might forget why they were angry or what they had been protesting. The bizarre cue was, therefore, an intentional, temporary erasure of the self, the legacy of the shock. For decades, ECT was overused and abused, particularly in the treatment of women who suffered from non-psychotic depression or anxiety that was viewed as simple moral failing. The public image, cemented by literature and film, became one of brutality and coercion. However, the final part of the ECT story is one of reluctant scientific nuance.
Modern medicine has retained the technique, but has refined it radically. Imagine the modern procedure. It is conducted under full general anesthesia and with muscle relaxants. The patient is asleep, and the physical seizure is reduced to a subtle tremor in the feet, preventing physical injury.
The electricity is delivered in a highly controlled minute dose, targeted for maximum therapeutic effect on the brain's chemical pathways.
Modern, modified ECT is now reserved as a last resort treatment for severe, drug-resistant depression and mania, where it can be remarkably effective and life-saving. The mechanism is still not fully understood, but it is no longer seen as erasing symptoms, but as physically altering the brain's chemical imbalance in a targeted way.
The history of ECT is a quiet, powerful reminder that the bizarre cure often contains a kernel of unintended truth. The shock was real, the power was undeniable, but the ethical and humane application required decades of refinement and a complete abandonment of the idea that the mind needed to be violently conquered into submission. Let this final image of the past settle. The quiet of your own space is one of profound safety and rest, far from the jarring noise of those early institutional walls.
Turning our attention now to the most final, irreversible, and arguably the most devastating of the bizarre cures ever devised for severe mental illness, the prefrontal lobotomy. This procedure was the ultimate expression of the medical belief that the complex mind could be fixed with a simple, brute force surgical intervention. The lobotomy was not explicitly a cure for hysteria, but by the mid-20th century, it was widely applied to the most chronic, intractable neuroses, the very patients whose profound anxiety and obsessive behaviors had long ago earned them the label of hysteric. Severing the circuits, the procedure's conceptual father was Portuguese neurologist E.G.S. Moniz. In the early 1930s, Moniz theorized that severe, chronic mental illness was caused by fixed, pathological thought circuits and neural pathways in the brain that were stuck in a loop of anxiety, obsession, or delusion. His logic was chillingly simple. If the circuit is flawed, cut the wire.
His original procedure, which he called a leucotomy, involved drilling small holes in the skull and injecting alcohol into the brain's white matter to destroy the nerve fibers connecting the frontal lobe, the seat of personality, planning,
and complex emotion, to the thalamus, the central relay station for sensory and motor signals. The immediate, observed effect was a dramatic reduction in emotional intensity. The patients became docile, quiet, and largely free of their intense anxiety or obsessive thoughts. They were, however, also free of much of their personality. Walter Freeman and the icepick lobotomy, the man who truly industrialized and popularized this bizarre cure in the United States, was American physician Walter Freeman.
Freeman was dissatisfied with the complexity and time required for Moniz's original procedure, and he sought a faster, more accessible method. His ambition led to the creation of the transorbital lobotomy. Imagine the terrifying simplicity of Freeman's approach.
He used an instrument designed for his method, the leucotome, a thin, sharp instrument resembling an icepick, which he called an orbitoclast.
The procedure was rapid and often performed right in the asylum,
sometimes without general anesthesia, requiring only a preliminary electric shock to render the patient unconscious. The patient's eyelid was lifted, and the sharp tip of the instrument was inserted through the thin bone above the eye, directly into the brain's frontal lobe.
Picture the small, chilling details of the procedure. The sound of a small hammer tapping the orbitoclast through the fragile bone, followed by the quiet swish as Freeman manually swept the instrument back and forth within the brain tissue, severing the connections. The goal was to render the patient emotionally flat and manageable. Freeman famously performed hundreds of these procedures in rapid succession, traveling across America in his lobotomobile. He sold the bizarre cure as a quick, elegant fix for everything from depression to nonconformity, the erased personality.
The tragedy of the lobotomy was that the ultimate bizarre cure for anxiety was the creation of a permanent emotional void. Patients who survived the procedure were often relieved of their most intense, painful symptoms, but at a terrible cost. They were frequently left with emotional flattening, becoming passive, apathetic, and childlike. Their judgment was impaired, their ability to plan was destroyed, and they often required constant, lifelong care.
The complex, difficult, anxious individual was replaced by a quiet, docile dependent. The lobotomy, in its final effect, was the ultimate physical embodiment of the rest cure's goal, the total erasure of the difficult self. The patient was finally quiet, but the spark of their individuality was extinguished forever. The quiet demise of the cure. The high point of this bizarre cure was a moment of deep medical irony. In 1949, Egidius Moniz received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his work on the leucotomy. This award cemented the procedure's temporary legitimacy and led to its mass application across the globe. However, the tide turned rapidly. The horrifying long-term outcomes, documented by concerned families and doctors, and the advocacy of individuals like Rosemary Kennedy's family who suffered a botched procedure, led to increasing condemnation. The final death blow to the lobotomy came not from moral outrage, but from chemistry. In the mid-1950s, the first truly effective psychiatric medication, chlorpromazine marketed as Thorazine, became widely available. This drug could achieve a similar level of emotional calming and institutional compliance without the irreversible damage caused by the knife.
Why destroy a brain when you could quiet it with a pill?
The ultimate bizarre cure, the most drastic physical intervention in the history of mental illness, was quietly retired. Its legacy a devastating reminder of the dangers of seeking a simple solution to the complex problem of the human mind. Let this knowledge settle over you now. The shadows of those knives and the silent fate of those patients are a final, profound lesson.
The quiet you find here is a sanctuary where the mind is whole and untouched. Rest deeply in the peace of the present.
Let us continue our quiet journey, focusing now on the momentous, silent revolution that finally provided an alternative to the physically brutal, bizarre cures of the asylum. The advent of psychiatric medications. The history of mental health is divided into two eras, before and after the discovery of the first effective psychiatric drugs.
This chemical revolution did not cure hysteria because the diagnosis was already being retired, but it provided a humane way to manage the suffering that had for centuries been treated with shock and surgery. The accidental quiet, chlorpromazine. The breakthrough came, as is often the case in science, entirely by accident in the early 1950s.
French chemists were experimenting with antihistamines, hoping to find a better drug to calm surgical patients.
They synthesized a compound called chlorpromazine.
Imagine the surprise when doctors began using this drug on psychiatric patients.
It quickly became clear that chlorpromazine had a profound and unique effect. It could quiet the most severe symptoms of psychosis, the paranoia, the hallucinations, the aggressive behavior without inducing deep sedation or coma. It calmed the internal chaos, allowing the patient to become present and conversational.
This was a profound change.
Before chlorpromazine, a patient suffering from severe psychosis or mania could only be managed through heavy restraints, continuous sedation, or the violent interventions of lobotomy and ECT.
Now, a simple pill could achieve a level of quiet compliance that was both humane and temporary.
Chlorpromazine, marketed globally as Thorazine, became known as the chemical straitjacket. This nickname is double-edged. It acknowledges the drug's power to control behavior, but also the gentle relief it provided from the physical restraints and the constant noise of a chaotic mind. It quieted the wards, allowing the patient to finally rest. The emptying of the asylums, the impact of thorazine was immediate and systemic.
It was the single greatest factor in the mid-20th century movement of deinstitutionalitas. Picture the massive, crowded wards of the old Victorian asylums.
Before thorazine, chronic patients, including those long ago labeled hysteric, remained locked away because they were deemed unmanageable. With the advent of this medication, thousands of patients could be stabilized and, for the first time, considered candidates for release back into their communities. The bizarre cure of the asylum isolation, control,
and erasure was rendered obsolete by the drug. The massive brick structures that symbolized confinement began to empty, marking the silent, final chapter of the asylum age. The chemical attack on melancholy following the success of thorazine. Researchers began searching for chemical interventions for the severe depression and debilitating anxiety that had long been misdiagnosed as melancholic hysteria. Again, the breakthrough came unexpectedly in the mid-1950s.
Two different classes of drugs were discovered to have profound antidepressant effects. Amao inhibitors MAOIs, like iproniazid, initially developed for tuberculosis, were observed to elevate the mood of patients who took them. Tricyclic antidepressants TCAs, like imipramine, initially tested as an antipsychotic, were found to alleviate deep depression. These discoveries provided the first genuine chemical means to intervene in the profound sadness and nervous depletion that had once been attributed to wandering vapors or nervous bankruptcy.
The persistent, heavy anxiety of the hysteric could, for the first time, be treated with a targeted chemical adjustment. The new trade-off. The chemical revolution brought immense relief, but it did not eliminate the bizarre elements of the cure.
It merely relocated them. The new trade-off was between the relief of symptoms and the burden of side effects.
Imagine the early patients on these powerful drugs. While their psychosis was quieted, they might develop involuntary muscle spasms and tremors, a neurological condition called tardive dyskinesia. While their depression lifted, they might suffer from paralyzing dry mouth, blurred vision, or dramatic weight gain.
The body was free of the knife and the shock, but it was now under a different kind of control, the quiet, constant management of the chemical. The bizarre cure had transformed from an external, shocking event into a daily internal contract with a pill.
The fundamental ethical question remains, is the pill curing the patient, or simply making the suffering manageable for both the individual and the society around them? Are we allowing the patient to express their internal chaos in a chemical world, or are we chemically enforcing the same quiet compliance that the asylum once enforced with walls and locks? The enduring legacy.
The advent of psychiatric medication marks the end of the history of bizarre physical cures for hysteria.
No surgeon would ever again remove a uterus to cure a headache, and the need for frequent lobotomies vanished. The modern chemical cure is a quiet triumph. It offers dignity, autonomy, and relief.
But it also presents a final, subtle challenge.
We must ensure that the quiet provided by the pill does not prevent us from pursuing the deeper, sociological truth that true and lasting cure requires addressing the trauma, the poverty, the social isolation, and the discrimination that caused so much of the suffering in the first place. The pill can quiet the symptoms, but it is listening that cures the systemic illness.
The quiet is ours now, free from the violence of the past. Let us rest in the peace provided by a more compassionate, if still imperfect, understanding of the human mind. We must acknowledge that even though the word hysteria was officially retired, the pattern of diagnosing complex, intense, and often female-driven emotional suffering with a highly stigmatizing,
generalized label did not disappear. It merely changed its name to borderline personality disorder, or BPD. This diagnosis represents the final, quiet echo of the hysteric in modern clinical practice, inheriting much of the stigma, gender bias, and clinical frustration that plagued its predecessor, the borderland of illness. The term borderline emerged in the mid-20th century, initially used by psychoanalysts who found a subset of their patients exceptionally difficult to treat.
These patients seem to be permanently on the border, too organized to be truly psychotic, hallucinating, or delusional, but too chaotic, impulsive, and intense to be successfully treated by traditional Freudian talk therapy neurotic.
The traditional analytical couch, which worked well for classic neuroses rooted in repression, seemed only to agitate these borderline patients, leading to intense emotional crises, chaotic external behavior,
and often the abandonment of therapy. The clinical language used to describe these patients was alarmingly similar to the language used for the hysteric a century earlier. They were described as manipulative, demanding, attention-seeking, and resistant to insight. They were the problem patients who confounded the neat categories of the diagnostic and statistical manual.
The modern gender bias, just as hysteria disproportionately targeted women, BPD has historically been a highly gendered diagnosis. For decades, up to 75% of those diagnosed with BPD in clinical settings were women. Picture the symptoms: intense, unstable emotions, emotional dysregulation, a frantic fear of abandonment, impulsive and risky behaviors, and a profound disturbance of identity and unstable sense of self.
When a woman exhibits these symptoms, the medical gaze often defaults to personality failure, the belief that the problem is her very character.
When similar instability is observed in men, it is often assigned diagnoses with less interpersonal stigma, such as substance abuse disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD). The modern hysteric, therefore, is the woman whose intense suffering and need for connection is often misread as a calculated effort to control or manipulate, echoing the 19th century doctor's belief that the hysteric symptoms were merely a dramatic performance.
The quiet, hidden truth of her suffering is drowned out by the noise of the label, BPD, and the legacy of trauma. The most critical and compassionate development in the understanding of BPD is the conclusive link to childhood trauma,
which finally unites this diagnosis with the root cause of historical hysteria.
Modern research shows that a vast majority of individuals diagnosed with BPD have a history of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, particularly emotional neglect, chronic invalidation, or physical or sexual abuse.
Their emotional systems did not fail.
They were permanently dysregulated by a chaotic, threatening, and non-nurturing early environment.
Their profound fear of abandonment is not a flaw in character.
It is a primal, desperate survival mechanism born from a childhood where abandonment was a very real, constant threat.
The impulsive behaviors are not manipulative. They are maladaptive attempts to cope with overwhelming emotional pain that feels unbearable. The person with BPD is not a modern hysteric performing for attention. She is a survivor whose emotional alarm system is permanently stuck on high alert. The conversion symptom of the hysteric was the body speaking the trauma.
The BPD symptom is the emotional system speaking the trauma.
The problem is not character.
It is chronic environmental injury. The compassionate cure, DBT.
The ultimate bizarre cure for this modern diagnosis arrived in the 1980s with dialectical behavior therapy (DBT), developed by psychologist Marsha Linehan.
Linehan, who later revealed her own history of BPD and institutionalization, recognized that the traditional therapeutic approach was inherently invalidating and punitive. Imagine the atmosphere of DBT, a quiet, structured room where the therapist accepts the patient exactly as they are, validating their pain and the difficulty of their life, while simultaneously insisting that they must change. This is the dialectical balance.
The cure is not analysis.
It is education. DBT teaches for core skill modules, all designed to replace the maladaptive, impulsive responses with concrete, practice tools, mindfulness, learning to focus on the present moment and tolerate emotional pain without judgment, distress tolerance, learning techniques to survive emotional crises without making the situation worse, for example, self-harm or impulse buying, emotion regulation, learning to identify, understand, and change intense emotions,
interpersonal effectiveness,
learning how to ask for what you need and set limits while maintaining self-respect. This is the ultimate evolution of the talking cure. A compassionate, skills-based approach that views the patient not as manipulative, but as skill-deficient in a complex, chaotic world. The quiet revolution of DBT is the true, final victory against the spirit of hysteria. It replaces judgment with compassion and the demand for silent compliance with the teaching of practical skills. It allows the individual to integrate their past trauma without being defined by it.
Let this knowledge bring you a profound sense of rest and acceptance.
The long, bizarre history of misdiagnosis leads us finally to a point of quiet, compassionate understanding.
The suffering is real, and the cure is simply the patient's right to be heard and taught the skills to heal. Rest now, free of all labels, in the simple truth of your being.